Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome. I hope you can hear me. If somebody can let me know that they can hear me, that would be much appreciated.
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you. So yes, welcome to this conference from, sorry, excuse me. Welcome to this conference from the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew, which is titled Botany, Trade and Empire, Exploring Kew's Miscellaneous Reports Collection. I'm Fiona Ainsworth. I am Head of Library Art and Archives at Kew, and it's my great pleasure to start the proceedings today. I'm thrilled that we've had the maximum number of 1,000 registrants for this conference, with attendees from around the world. This is wonderful and far more than we could possibly have accommodated at an in-person event at Kew, and it reflects the high level of interest in the topics we will be exploring over the next 3 days. In a moment, I will hand over to Professor Alex Antonelli, Kew's Director of Science, to open the conference, but first I have some housekeeping items to run through. I just want to let you know that the event is being recorded. Attendees are reminded that your cameras and audio have been automatically switched off. We will be using the Q&A function for questions. To use this facility, please click on the button at the bottom of your screen. Please write your question in the Q&A bar at the side. Questions and answers will be at the end of each session, and we will do our best to get to as many questions as possible. A particular welcome to those watching via the YouTube live stream. Unfortunately, we will be unable to take questions from this audience. I'd like to remind attendees that there is a closed caption option which allows you to see live captioning. Please click on the button at the bottom of the screen if you want to use this facility. I hope you enjoyed the 3 days of sessions which the conference team have put together. We have a wonderful array of talks lined up, and I look forward to the questions and discussions which will come out of them. It's my belief that we are just at the start of those conversations. Now it's my great pleasure to hand over to Professor Alex Antonelli to officially open the conference. Alex, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Fiona. And first of all, I'd like to thank the Linnean Society and the Bentham Moxon Trust for their essential support for this conference, and to the Wellcome Trust Research Resources Scheme for supporting cataloging and conserving of the miscellaneous reports. So this is really the first meeting on the Miscellaneous Reports Collection, which I personally find to be one of the absolutely most fascinating and important among all of Kew's vast collections. They hold a really huge potential which hasn't really been fully realized, and this conference is one step towards unlocking that treasury trove. So this conference has 3 main goals: to make the Miscellaneous Reports Collection better known to a wider audience, to highlight research already done and identify future research potential of the collection, and to emphasize Kew's Arts and Humanities Research Program. This conference is also an important part of a wider process to explore and interrogate Kew's collections from a decolonization perspective. So just yesterday, Kew launched our new Manifesto for Change, which is our corporate strategy for this whole decade. It sets out very clearly how, in a time of biodiversity crisis, we must focus our mission on understanding and protecting plants and fungi for the well-being of people and the future of all life on Earth. As one of the largest research institutes for plants and fungi in the world, we are committing our over 300 science staff, our collections, and our labs to this urgent task. What has become very clear in the last year, since the deaths of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and others, and the subsequent waves of protests led by the Black Lives Matter movement around the world, is that this contemporary role cannot be separated from Kew's history. Many structural inequalities in our society, both in Britain and in many countries with whom we partner overseas, have their origins in the extraction of wealth from the global south by countries in the global north during the colonial era. Growing up in the next colony myself, Brazil, and as a descendant of indigenous communities in the country, I've witnessed long-term social impacts of these inequalities in the country. As we will hear during this conference, plants were and are deeply implicated in this colonial process. I'll give two examples: the transfer of plants such as rubber and the fever trees in China to plantation agriculture with large impacts on landscapes and people, and the introduction of many of the ornamental plants so prominent in gardens today. More than any other of Kew's archives, these 772 volumes of the Miscellaneous Reports, about which we'll learn more today from Richard Drayton and Rachael Gardner, offer extraordinary insights into the global interplay between environmental, economic, scientific, and imperial histories, spanning the mid-19th to the mid-20th centuries. This conference has its origins several years ago, actually. So when Kew first secured support from the Wellcome Trust for the Miscellaneous Reports project. Work over the last 2.5 years by project archivist Rachael Gardner and conservator Aimee Crickmore has made this collection accessible, from being almost inaccessible and largely unknown before. They have opened up the collection and safeguarded it for the future, with the online record of every volume being publicly available online by the end of March. We'll be hearing from them both later in the program. Both the Wellcome Project and this conference are part of a wider, rapidly expanding program of research at Kew that draws on the arts, humanities, and social sciences, disciplines that are increasingly embedded in Kew's interdisciplinary research culture. These disciplines give us tools to acknowledge and address the connections between past and present, and are essential in delivering our scientific mission. Kew's Manifesto for Change sets out our ambition to build new, deeper partnerships and collaborations with experts in different disciplines. We very much hope that this conference will encourage some of you to approach us to discuss possible synergies. Like all other organizations, since summer 2020, Kew has been reassessing its past and present activities, recognizing that many current injustices inside and outside Britain have their roots in the UK's colonial past. As part of this work, a team of Kew staff has been taking a holistic view of Kew's history, current day science, and engagement with the public, asking how we can improve our commitment to equity and inclusion, whether to our staff, students, and volunteers, or to our partners in research and conservation worldwide, or to our digital and real-life visitors. I'm very grateful to those of you listening today who have joined in these conversations and generously shared your experiences and expertise. The findings of the group will be integrated into Kew's work, including our science strategy launching this summer. One of the aims of this conference is to make the Miscellaneous Reports collection better known and more widely used. We recognize our responsibility to share our collections worldwide. In response, a pillar of Kew's new science strategy will be digitization. This will be a long and technically complex process, you can imagine, because imaging is just one step, perhaps the easiest one, in giving access. The cataloging of the Miscellaneous Reports is another crucial component, making these 772 bound volumes searchable. In fact, digitization relies on both cataloging and conservation, both of which have now been achieved. Later this afternoon, Fiona Ainsworth, Kew's head of library, who you just listened to, will tell us about plans to digitize the Miscellaneous Reports collection in partnership with a commercial publisher, enabling significantly better access to the reports in a vastly more usable archive. As we'll hear over the next 3 days, our archives are a truly remarkable resource. They underpin the work of many researchers, ranging from historians to artists and scientists. My colleagues and I are absolutely committed to expanding use of these collections. We'll continue to take an active role in developing new projects, but with far greater attention to recovering excluded histories, to encouraging the writing of histories from a range of perspectives, and to widening access to all who could benefit from their use. Our collaboration on the third day of this conference with the Black Cultural Archives is a very exciting forerunner of the future. So just before finishing, I want to extend a huge thanks to all my colleagues who have worked flat out to make this conference happen. In particular, Rachael Gardner, David Ugalden, Caroline Cornish, and Kiri Ross-Jones, with support from Mark Nesbitt, Fiona Ainsworth, Chelsea Snell, Catherine Harrington, and everyone else helping behind the scenes. My most sincere thank you. I'll now hand over to Caroline Cornish, who will chair the next segment and introduce the keynote speaker for today, Professor Richard Drayton.
Thank you, Alex, and hello, everyone. I'm thrilled that the privilege of introducing the keynote speaker for the first day of this conference falls to me. He's someone who has fundamentally shaped my own thinking on Kew and its historical relationship to empire. Far beyond that, he has provided an enduring model for all of us who wish to better understand Kew's historical entanglements with the Imperial project. Richard Drayton is Rhodes Professor of Imperial History at King's College London. Born in Guyana, he grew up in Barbados before leaving to study at the universities of Harvard, Oxford, and Yale. Richard's doctoral thesis focused on Kew's contribution to the agri-development of British colonial territories, what was known as economic botany. And he conducted much of his archival research at Kew Gardens. He's the author of Nature's Government, Science, Imperial Britain, and the Improvement of the World, which 20 years on remains the definitive work on the subject. Speaking today to the title, The Kew Gardens Miscellaneous Reports as an Archive of Global History, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Richard Drayton.
The Miscellaneous Reports are a collection of about 800 bound volumes of material. They're principally arranged geographically, with one series on Europe, different series on different parts of Latin America, and really including the entire vegetable world. About 1/5 of these are on India, but there are materials from Brazil, from the Dutch East Indies, that's to say modern Indonesia, from Australia, from every part of the world. What they consist of are letters to the directors of Kew, coming from colonial servants in the colonies, in particular the people who were directing botanic gardens, from colonial administrators in the colonies, from people in the colonial office, from businessmen in London, from planters in the colonies, from ordinary servants. And what they concern are principally the economic uses of plants. But they also contain a variety of other kinds of material, newspaper clippings, photographs, and actual physical samples of plant materials. So they represent an extraordinarily rich archive. What is an archive? An archive is a body of documents created by an individual or a company or an entity to support the work which they're doing, and which later on can provide a resource through which historians can make sense of a particular period in the past through looking at documents which were contemporary to the events which they wish to understand. And this particular archive, which for most of its history has been kept away from the public, represents a really unequaled archive for making sense of much of the world, and in particular, the former colonies of the British Empire. I'm told that there are about 1,000 of you who've registered for this event. So I'm presuming that many of you have not in fact been to Britain, let alone been to Kew, and that people will be coming from a variety of disciplines. So I thought I should first of all quickly take us into the context for this particular collection. First, if the machine will allow me to, yeah. First, we can look at the geography. So that Kew Gardens here are located, as you can see, to the west of London, on the last bit of the Thames before you arrive in London. They were the site of a minor royal palace, from particularly significant in the 18th century, when it was the space occupied by, first of all, the mother of George III, and then by George III and his wife. Indeed, when George III had his first problem with mental illness, he was confined at Kew House. But it also became a place where the royal family began to collect plants. First of all, as private collectors, and then later on through plant collectors sent to various parts of the world. And there are various other, spectacular buildings, such as the emblematic building of the pagoda, which is also built in the late 18th century. Erasmus Darwin, the grandfather of Charles Darwin, wrote a long poem called The Botanic Garden, in which it published in 1789, which contains the phrase, so let me see if I can remember it correctly, so sits enthroned in vegetable pride, Imperial Kew by Thames' glittering side. Now, what did Erasmus Darwin mean by imperial when he wrote this? Well, he was certainly an imperial patriot. And he later on in the same verse describes Kew as a kind of symbol of the success of the monarchy. Elsewhere, he has this wonderful passage where he predicts what will be the consequences of the Priestley's discovery of oxygen. Led by the sage, Britain's sun shall guide huge sea balloons beneath the tossing tide, which leads then to the climax. Then will Britannia rule these wealthy realms, which oceans wide insatiate wave o'erwhelms, confine in netted bowers his scaly flocks, part its blue plains, and people all its rocks. So there is a colonial program which is part of Erasmus Darwin's story, but he means imperial in I think in quite a different sense, in a far older sense of the imperial as being a kind of summoning of the cosmopolitan. He talks later on in the same verse on Kew about how the tropics and the Antarctic are brought into reconciliation in this place. He's describing then, in other words, a particular 16th, 17th, 18th century idea of the Botanic Garden as a kind of culmination of nature from all parts of the world brought into a kind of reconciliation. 50 years later, Kew was imperial in a sense which we would understand. From 1840, Kew Gardens becomes a public institution, and under its director, William Jackson Hooker, it begins a whole program, first of all, of the development of the physical space of the gardens, including the building of this emblematic building, the great Palm House at Kew. But Hooker also goes beyond that, and he begins to create what he calls a museum of economic botany. Well, I'll come to the herbarium in a second, because in fact, historically, it comes second. The Museum of Economic Botany he creates in the 1850s. And he creates it with a deliberate intention to show, it's an act of bureaucratic ostentation, that Kew will render service to the public in terms of making accessible to British manufacturers, traders, industrialists, the uses of plants in different places, with a specific aim to increase the economic value of British colonies and to facilitate economic development. Scientists then as now were concerned to justify their usefulness to the public and to justify why it was that they deserved public support, and in particular in Hooker's case, why his son deserved to be hired as his assistant, and why he should be given resources to build a public herbarium. Now, what is a herbarium? A herbarium is, in Latin words, a hortus siccus, a dried garden. So you have the living garden of plants outside, and then you have the dried garden, which is a collection of plant specimens which are all pressed, and which allow you then to compare plants in different parts of the world and to decide how they can be organized into various families. This enterprise of the herbarium was closely linked to that get back control of my screen here. Probably have to do that. It's really annoying, this technology sometimes. Okay, so yeah, so yes, the herbarium and the Botanic and the Museum of Economic Botany were very closely linked, and their other partner was the library. And the library starts off as a private library of the hooker and his son, and he assimilates into that library the library of his father-in-law and various other friends. But it becomes eventually a public library of Kew, which contains its own archive, its own working collection of papers. And what we call the Miscellaneous Reports is very much a kind of partner to the Museum of Economic Botany. But it's also the partner to the herbarium, because that geographical set of divisions I talked about earlier on represented the classic geographical descriptions of the herbarium. They were intended, in other words, to gather all the uses of plants in one museum, connected to all of the dried specimens which exist in the herbarium, and connected then to the library and to the archives and to the kind of scientific advice which Hooker was then able to render. Now, it would not be until the end of the 19th century that the third director of Kew, William Thistleton Dyer, would actually be called formally the botanical advisor to the Secretary of State for the Colonies. But William Jackson Hooker and his son, Joseph Dalton Hooker, were effectively playing this role from decades before. They were being consulted about the planting of palm oil plantations, about the creation of rubber plantations, about the value of particular kinds of timber and dyestuffs, on arrow poisons in Africa. And they were pulling together their responses to these queries from, first of all, books which they had in their libraries, from their herbarium, but also from this Museum of Economic Botany. So a whole body of paper begins to develop behind these institutions. This is a photograph of the museum. Oh, never mind. Well, I was going to show you a couple of documents from the Miscellaneous Reports, but I'm sure that some of the other speakers at this conference will be doing that. But it's an extraordinary resource because it contains photographs, not just of plants, but indeed of phenomena which lie beside the Botanic Gardens. There's a picture of a power station that had just been constructed in Canada, pictures of road building. But quite apart from pictures, it contains an extraordinary record of contemporary social history. So there are accounts of interactions with gardeners, interactions with the publics of Calcutta or of Colombo or of Bridgetown or of Kingston. They collect records of rainfall such that they could provide a resource, much like the famous ship's logs for people working on climate change. You may not know this, but British vessels, when they sailed on the seas, they would take daily readings of climate. And it so happens that over the last decade or so, people have started to use these maritime logs to reconstruct what climate was like in earlier periods of history in various parts of the world. Well, this Miscellaneous Reports collection, which contains a great deal of material from botanic gardens around the world, has a similar kind of value for reconstructing what local life was like. Now, these were documents created in order to facilitate the power of Britain and the prosperity of colonies and the wealth of British entrepreneurs. And they were collected by people who were concerned to, as colonial actors, to write back to the metropolis. But they also contain embedded in them the agency of historical actors, which they were not intended to preserve. So people who were under gardeners, people who were ordinary peasants in India, people who were hunter-gatherers in Borneo, Amerindians in Guyana, their experiences, their testimony is often recorded, obviously through the eyes of the European person on the ground, or of the colonist on the ground. But it is there in the archive to be liberated for those, in fact, who would choose to do so. Now, this particular archive of the miscellaneous reports spent a very, very long time essentially being far less important and considered to be far less important than the kinds of scientific correspondence which were part of what they called the director's letters at Kew. So indeed, when I first went to Kew at the age of 21, which was a very long time ago, you had an extremely well-preserved archives room, which had the bound volumes of the director's letters in dust-free and climate-controlled and carefully conserved and bound condition. And then you had the miscellaneous reports, which were piled together in a kind of basement. And you had a list. You can find this list yourself. If you look at Gavin Bridson et al.'s Guide to the Manuscript Resources for Natural History in the British Isles, that's what I used back in the 1980s and 90s, and it still is the work of reference. And you can look up the lists of materials, and then you can one would order up the volumes and see what you could find. But there was certainly not anything like a kind of clear indication of what the volumes contain, and certainly nothing like the kind of index which is being created now with the help of the Wellcome grant. So if I had access to my office in London, which is 40 miles away and locked down, I would have been able to kind of get out for you some of the notes which I created in that period, because I worked at Kew, first of all, in the summer of 1985. And then from January 1989 through to, in various periods, 1991. So I spent a rather long time working there. Now, what I can show you is let me zoom in a bit, is one page of footnotes from my book, Nature's Government, which reflects the kinds of documents which I was pulling together. So for example, footnote 43, Q 143, Q Brazil, cultural products, etc. That's a classic miscellaneous reports index, Q India United Provinces, 39 to 28. And the ones which I came for when I was an undergraduate, this is in 1985, which were Kew Barbados Agriculture, Agricultural Products, and Kew Barbados Sugarcane Experiments. What these records contain were the most important sources for understanding a particular episode in colonial science, which takes place in Barbados, which is the discovery of the fertility of sugarcane and the beginnings of a sugarcane breeding program. So there are some records at Kew, which under dispensation of the Public Records Act is able to act as a branch of the National Archives, an outsourced branch of the National Archives. There are other materials which are in the National Archives. There are other materials in the British Library. But all of these I was able to pull together for what was my undergraduate thesis, and then I returned to them later on when I was doing my PhD. But what I found in these sources, looking at footnote 157 here, were discussions of the Barbados economy in the 1880s, discussions of the social relations of the society, a record of a variety of local natural and social and cultural phenomena. And these were all locked away, all relatively inaccessible. Anyway, in the, let me get this document up for you. It's going to be Sylvia. So Sylvia Fitzgerald was the librarian of Kew. She was an extremely important figure in terms of the late 20th century organization of the archive. And any access to the library archives went through Sylvia. Anyway, Sylvia, having lived, since I essentially had been living at Kew for about a couple of years, Sylvia asked me to write a letter for her, which she said she'd be able to use with her senior colleagues to negotiate resources for Kew. And it's interesting to find this letter. I look back, I found it this weekend, looking on my archive. I had to convert it from an old word processing format. Anyway, so she asked me to write this letter, which I wrote in the summer of 1990. And it's interesting because in many of the things I'd want to say to you today, I actually was already thinking about at that point. So I kind of explained for the record what had brought me there. And then I made a few notes about the archive. First of all, that Kew is the trustee of one of the principal holdings of archival materials for the history of science in the world, and for botany, perhaps the most important single collection. And I noted that I raised this issue not out of fear for the papers of Banks, Bentham, or Hooker. I'm, however, concerned about the state of conservation of many of the bound miscellaneous reports on economic botany, which are shelved in the basement. Bindings are cracking, paper is yellowing. There's evidence that essentially they were neglected because they were not considered to be as important as other materials. And I went on to say that we don't a priori know the value of any historical document. Sources are made by historians. They don't exist in themselves. Historians bring new questions to old archives, and suddenly old material becomes more valuable. So, of course, climate change was not in the air at that time, but I did note that a minute about rainfall in North Borneo in 1898 might be as valuable as a kind of random note from Hooker to Huxley. And then I went on to say that Kew is not just a scientific archive, but it represents one of the most valuable, though largely underexploited archives for the general history of the non-European world. And particularly under the guidance of Banks and Hooker and Thurston Dyer, it was a key agency for coordinating the economic administration of British possessions. And through collectors, its influence spread through areas under the formal political control of others. And it's also the case that this material, which is often duplicate, in other words, it was sent by a particular entity in the colonies. So originally, these letters would often have one copy kept in the archive, in what would have been the working archive in Barbados. Another copy might have gone to the Colonial Office, and another copy then would have come to Kew. But the tendency, in fact, it's one of the obligations of archivists, is not just to keep material, but to destroy it. That's essential because you just simply can't keep everything. Space doesn't allow it. And the decisions have been taken across the years by archivists in the colonies has often been to destroy vast amounts of material because they didn't think it was going to be particularly interesting. And this was true for the Colonial Office. So, for example, all of the most interesting archives about sugarcane diseases and so on in in the West Indies. Some of them exist in the West Indian Department's records in the Colonial Office. So what's it now, series 3, what's it, 327, I can't remember. But in many cases, these only exist in Kew. So that, you know, for certain areas of the colonial history of Britain, and not just to Britain, because these guys were also recording what was happening in the Dutch colonies, in the independent states of Latin America, in bits of Africa which had not yet been formally brought under British possession, even bits of Africa under German administration. They were recording data, sending it back, and in some cases, Kew is the only repository for this. And that, fortunately, at least, these materials were not destroyed at Kew, as far as I know, but certainly they were very badly preserved because they simply were not considered to be that important. So Kew, therefore, I'm arguing today, as I argued then, not only the trustee of its own past and of the memory of botany, but of the modern experience of much of the world. And I proposed then, this is long before Kew had applied for its status as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, which happens, I think, in about 2007 or thereabouts, that it should apply to UNESCO for a grant to allow someone to create an intensive analytic index of its manuscript holdings, particularly in economic botany, on the basis of countries, products, events, and persons, etc., for publication. This is, of course, in a almost pre-digital age. I was writing this on a computer, but you know, there was no such thing as the World Wide Web or online databases. So I presume this would yield a kind of set of volumes, which could then be consulted. But of course, now with the digital, a variety of new kinds of opportunities exist. I also thought it was generally an archive that was not seeking to bring historians to it. Indeed, I think Jim Endesby has at least one or two anecdotes about the intensive interview he had to submit to before he was allowed access to the archives as a researcher. So that's in a way the background, really, which you need to carry into thinking about the substance of this conference. Well, what does it mean to say that something is an archive for global history? Well, it can mean, on the one hand, that it allows us to understand and to think about parts of the world which would otherwise not be represented in the archival record. But when we say global history, we also mean two particular historical methods. One is the comparative method, where one does a kind of enterprise of reciprocal comparison between phenomena in different parts of the world in order to make sense of what was specific or different about them. And the other is the connective, where we seek to establish how phenomena in one part of the world affected or shaped phenomena in the other. Now, this particular archive of the Miscellaneous Reports has the greatest potential for both of these approaches. For example, one can think about the vicissitudes of the plantation complex, which was not just a sugar plantation complex across the world. One could look at climate, as I noted. One could examine the impact of various economic crises across the 19th century and into the 20th century in terms of the local economies. One could examine the movements of things like plant diseases, because one of the characteristics of the movement of plants, which they only discovered at the end of the 19th century, or began to think about at the end of the 19th century, is that whenever you move plants from one place to another place, you also bring with them their pathogens, which in a new environment then can quickly find a new host and can wreak all sorts of local destruction. So that, you know, one could collect plant diseases in different parts of the world and think about them in a kind of comparative way. One could also do a very different kind of work in terms of trying to read the archive, as I suggested earlier, against the grain, to try to discover what we sometimes call indigenous agency. the ways in which the colonized were involved in the making of scientific knowledge and in the mediation of the economic enterprise of colonial expansion. I think one last note I'd want to kind of end on is that one of the things that I think we have to begin to consider in the 21st century is what I've called, in another context, digital repatriation. In the case of art objects, as many of you will know, there are ongoing debates and ongoing programs for the return to places in Africa. One thinks of the Benin bronzes, or India, or Melanesia, or Latin America, of objects which were taken from them, like Montezuma's crown brought to Vienna. And the question, how should these objects be returned? In the case of Montezuma's crown, which is now in Vienna and which was brought there at the collapse of Emperor Maximilian's adventure in Mexico in the middle of the 19th century, what they're doing is creating a physical simulacrum of the crown, trying to use indigenous techniques to create something which is an exact copy. Now, in the case of documents and archives, this is far easier to do. High quality digitization with a specific aim of ensuring that the collections for gutta percha in Sarawak, for logwood in Belize, for medicinal plants in Nigeria, that these things can be restored and made accessible in the places from which these specimens, observations, accounts, and records of historical agency were taken and were sent to Kew. Now, this isn't just a kind of something that's ethically good to do. We cannot really do an archive of this scale justice, and indeed justify Kew holding on to it, if that archive is not used in a very intensive and comprehensive way. There simply are not enough researchers who are likely to be able to afford to travel to Kew and to visit these archives in the archives room or the library to make proper use of them. So what is necessary really is to try to mobilize the intellectual curiosity of people around the world about the past of their own societies. I know my friends and colleagues at the University of the West Indies, for example, in Barbados, are busy creating a kind of an attempt to recover not just the built heritage or the landscape, but also to recover the environmental heritage and the scientific heritage of that island, and to bring this to involve students in research projects which can bring this material into a form which it can be read and thought about. There's huge opportunities for turning these materials which exist at Kew into resources for research, for teaching, and for the improvement of everyday life in many parts of the world. One could say that it opens up the possibility for a different kind of historical work, so global history in another sense, where we have forms of collaboration and cooperation between historians from the level of bright undergraduates doing their research papers through to people who are actually holding academic posts, to around the world, around making sense of these dimensions of the environmental, economic, political, social, and cultural history of the world, which at least when I last visited, which was a while ago, was still being confined to a basement in West London. What I think we've all found in the age of the digital is that less is more. So I think that in terms of a kind of initial presentation, I think this is probably enough for me to say at this point. And I'm very happy in our question and answer to develop these points more fully, or to add more information on anything else which is particularly interesting to you. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much, Richard. That was so much material in there. Absolutely fascinating. I'd now like to open up questions to our audience. I see we have a couple already in the Q&A, but do feel free to add more as things occur to you. So Richard, we have a question here from Richard Choksey, who asks, to what extent was the relationship of Joseph Banks to George III analogous to that of botanical advisor to the state? Or is this analogy anachronistic?
I think that analogy is slightly anachronistic. I think in a metaphorical, in a sense, it's correct, except that George III himself was not taking executive decisions, and I think it'd be closer to see Banks as being somebody who's working with Pitt and Dundas, who are two of George III's important ministers in this period, as well as with a variety of other actors, Hawkesbury, Lord Liverpool, and working also with people on the ground in Calcutta and in Australia. So that Banks is operating. I mean, as long as we imagine George III as not being an actual physical person, but being a kind of virtual person, as in the Crown, then I think that would be correct in terms of describing Banks's relationship. But it's a much less formal relationship, and of course, it's a relationship which involves much less dependence. People like the two Hookers or William Thistle Dyer are servants of the Crown. They're not people with independent wealth. Banks is an immensely wealthy man. So that he is performing a particular kind of public service, which is connected to his talents, his passions, and his social role. So it's not quite equivalent.
Okay, great, thank you. We have a couple of questions here which I think will be answered by speakers later in the conference. So I'll just acknowledge them, but I think that this isn't the moment that we can give you the answers to these. So Maria asks, to what extent is the present day archive digitized and publicly accessible? You'll be hearing a lot more about that later over the next day and the 2 days following. And we have another question from G, who asks, thanks us for introducing us to the collection. You are most welcome. But he asks, as part of efforts to further acknowledge the colonial and imperial history of Kew Gardens, do we envision that the name of this collection, the Miscellaneous Reports, will change in the future to more explicitly reflect the colonial history of the institution? So once again, if it's okay with you, your question is fully acknowledged. But I think that's something that, particularly on our panel discussions later in the conference and our roundtable, which will conclude, that we should be able to discuss in much more detail. Okay, so moving on, what do we have? We have a question from Mark Nesbitt. Can you think of any other underexplored archives on colonial history? This is one for you, Richard, definitely. Any that overlap with Kew's focus?
Well, I suppose one could do far more work with the Linnean Society than has been done. I mean, if you want to specifically look at Kew's focus. I do think there's lots of the National Archives that are still underexploited. One could, once again, I think that the National Archives represents another collection which really should be made publicly accessible to every former British colony. I think it's a scandal that people from Barbados have to travel to London to work on the history of Barbados. And that these, I think at some point, the question of the digital repatriation of these archival resources has got to come onto the agenda. But to try to answer your question, what other materials are there? I mean, I think there are a number of institutions that are analogous to Kew, but less important than Kew, in my view, like the Royal Geographical Society, which also has substantial materials of all kinds, which have only partially been brought to public attention. The National Maritime Museum has brought a number of researchers to its space. But once again, that also contains many things that have not been made accessible, particularly to people outside of Britain, who either can't afford to come here or who would find it difficult to get a visa to come here from many parts of the world. But I think these, I wasn't sure from your question whether you meant specifically scientific archives or whether you meant more generally, because I think also there are vast amounts of business archives which remain to be excavated. But I think this is we could draw up quite a long list if we tried hard.
Okay, great, thank you. We have a question from Stephanie, Richard. She says, I'm interested in thinking more about floristic agency on the part of the local colonized peoples, especially in terms of botanical knowledge as resistance to exchange and commerce. Could you talk about this a bit more and how the archive might reveal some of this?
Yes, I'm sure that it would. It would require a kind of very sensitive and well-informed reader to spot where these kinds of resistances are taking place. I mean, what we do know, as you know, I'm sure, is that in all of the kind of classic European collections of plant information, whether we're thinking about the Hortus malabaricus in the 17th century or the Herbarium Amboinse, or whether we're thinking about the collections of Adanson in Senegal, all of these classificatory enterprises are deeply influenced by what were pre-colonial, to use this awful kind of closet word, filing word, indigenous forms of knowledge and agency. And I'm sure that we would find this as we go along in the process. My colleague Jim Endesby, of course, has a very interesting argument where he argues that it's characteristic of the classifiers in the field to make fine discriminations between varieties of plants. And it's characteristic of those who are operating from the perspective of London to seek forms of simplification. And to, in fact, reduce complexity to very simple categories. And this business of the kind of suppression of complexity is surely something which we would be able to uncover. Not so much, I would be thinking in terms of the miscellaneous reports, but more in terms of the kind of director's letters that surround the herbarium. I mean, this happens with Europeans themselves, so that, for example, someone who you will know, Schomburg in Guyana, keeps sending back descriptions of specimens to London and classifications which undoubtedly he's been influenced in by the people who were helping him to collect plants on the ground. And he gets dismissed from the perspective of London as being a species monger. He's making far too many fine discriminations between categories for the purposes of George Bentham or William Jackson Hooker, who want to simplify things so that it can be all viewed as a whole, as a kind of global, all the families of plants as a whole. And I think if this is happening to a European observer, one can only imagine what Schomburg himself on the ground is doing with the information which he is being supplied. In terms of picking and choosing what he chooses to represent as a kind of defining family relationship or a point of discrimination between different specimens. And I think there is work to be done in terms of decolonizing the herbarium, in terms of thinking about this complex pattern of intellectual interactions and the way in which they both produce particular outcomes and the way in which they conceal alternative ways of making sense of the data, which 60 or 70 or 80 or 100 years later, often with the basis of new scientific techniques like DNA, that in fact plants are then being reclassified. And I suspect it's not unlikely that we will find, when we look at some of these reclassifications, that we'll find in fact that the original observers were probably in fact on the money. And that's a whole terrain which I can only describe the outlines of. It's not an area which I've worked in myself.
Okay, great, thank you. We have so many questions, but a very interesting one from Martha Fleming. Hi, Martha. So she asks you, to what extent do you believe that your current methods, your research methods, were actually developed through or emergent from your work in the Miscellaneous Reports and in collaboration with Kew's Archivists? So I think there's a couple of questions in that. There's the idea of co-production of knowledge. To what extent does the archivist shape what you can see, and so forth? And your current methods, well, we know that your interests have moved some way along the line in the last few years. So.
I think I'd tell the story a different way, which is to say that the intellectual tradition which I come out of, for which the kind of boundary stones are figures like Eric Williams, had already created a program in the mid-20th century, Williams, James, Rodney, which had to do with understanding the colonial origins of the West. And it's really, I mean, if you want to understand what I wanted to do with Kew, I wanted to write a kind of capitalism and slavery for the sciences, and to actually to make an argument analogous to the argument which Williams made in Capitalism and Slavery about the ways in which forms of colonial expansion constructed forms of modernity within the imperial center. And for Williams, his concern was looking at forms of economic modernity. I was interested in making sense of forms of scientific modernity and forms of knowledge practices, and how these were constructed as part of a global order organized by European imperialism. So in other words, there were particular questions which I was proving in the terrain of Kew, and which I learned a lot when I was doing that about how one might think about that in a more sophisticated way. And these are questions which I then carried on. So that, to my mind, there's a kind of there's more a set of problems which I brought to the archive. As to the ways in which the archive has changed what I've done, I mean, I think it's more the process of working with the archive which gave me a whole variety of new kinds of expertise with different archival materials, even working with sources in different languages, which all that kind of process of apprenticeship, which is part of a PhD experience, that certainly has been very portable. But it's hard to think about something which I can really point to in terms of coming out of the miscellaneous reports, which served as a kind of spur. But I'll think about it. I mean, there may well be something there I'm not thinking about. But thank you for that.
Okay, great. We have a question here from Frankie Kubici, who asks, who comments, first of all, she was interested to see the letter from the 1990s, included thoughts that you still agree with today, and she'd be keen to undertake an exercise of a comparative method, to hear how your thoughts are different between then and now. So some things remain the same for you. What has changed?
I mean, how this is one of the problems with oral history. You can only ask somebody at time t+10 or t+20 to evaluate where they are relative to a time t, and essentially my narrative is very much one of where I am now. And I'm afraid to say, I don't know whether this is a good or a bad thing, but I think there's actually an extraordinary amount of continuity in what I was thinking and wanting to argue when I was 20, and what I was thinking and wanting to argue when I was 50. In fact, probably even from the age of about 10 or 15, although I had different kinds of points of reference. I mean, I looked at that letter and I was just astonished to think, in fact, that I couldn't have written it better myself now. I think I was very clear, and I had a clear sense of what the potentials were. So I don't know what that means. I just haven't grown any since then, or or what. But I can't really see much of a gap. Doesn't seem that, also that thing doesn't seem that long ago. That's a terrible thing.
Yeah, absolutely. We have another slightly speculative one here to follow up. How would digital availability of the miscellaneous reports have changed the direction and outcome of your previous research?
I think I would have been able to do a lot more at one level. I would have had far more examples. I think I would have been able to kind of, when I zoomed in at particular case studies, I would have been able to do so for more places and possibly more comprehensively, because of course research time is always limited, and you can't. Having taken notes from a particular document, I couldn't then go back 2 or 3 times. I could sometimes check them, but I couldn't go back 3 or 4 times and check what was there. Whereas if it was digital, one could essentially have this recursive process of going back and forth between text and archive. So I might have done more. But I do think that I would have missed a lot, because I think that working with a physical archive, this is something I always have to tell my research students, is that there's a poverty to the digital. I mean, it's a wonderful resource, but there's nothing quite like having a sense of the texture of the paper, and of what is next to what. There's a contextual character to information in an archive and to sources in an archive, which is very important. I've gathered that there's now at Kew a proper archives room with a distinct kind of area of preservation. And at some level, I'm glad that I went in the old days, because in the old days, I could literally walk along a shelf and see what was shelved next to what. And then I could tell the thing I'd like to look at that, having not in fact known about it before. So that there's nothing quite like being in the physical archive space. And in particular, in the case of Kew, having that extraordinary library in proximity to your archival work, because when one is working with an archive, it's often of the greatest value to be able to then call up the printed materials which are relative to that collection. The other thing to bear in mind is that the digitization of sources for the sciences, and particularly for the history of science, is often, in fact, at still quite an early stage. So take, for example, that resource I mentioned, Gavin Bridson et al. Guide to the Natural History Resources for the British Isles. I was looking for that when I was thinking about what I'd say for this that lecture recording, which you saw, and it doesn't exist in a digital form. I couldn't even find it on one of the, well, a friend of mine couldn't find it on one of the Russian sites, bootleg sites. So, I mean, that's an instance of something where if I was working digitally, I wouldn't be able to kind of pull the volume down and flip to the page. So I think the digital is a great substitute for travel if you cannot travel. But if you can actually be in an archive and work in an archive next to the people who know that archive, and beside researchers who are also working in that archive, that is always going to be several times better.
Great, thank you. And I think that echoes the thoughts of Amy, who had put a question in the Q&A, which was that doesn't digitization in some ways minimize the connection between media and material? So in fact, you have answered that already. We have a question here from Anna, which I think, Anna, is another one of those which will be answered during the course of the next 3 days. Are there any current projects such as rewilding or conservation which draw upon this kind of archival material? Well, the simple answer is yes, and lots of researchers come to Kew and use our resources, not just historians. In the session later this afternoon, we'll be hearing from an artist who has used the miscellaneous reports in his creative practice. So hang on to that, and I think you'll find some more answers to that as we go through the next 3 days. Okay, there was one from Felix Driver, who points out to us that digital repatriation has long been supported by Kew scientists. So, for example, there's a program with Brazil called Reflora, which has digitized all of the Brazilian specimens in Kew's herbarium for complete sharing between the two countries. So Phyllis's question is, does this mean that scientists are ahead of the historians on this?
Well, I think Kew's principally thought of itself as a scientific institution. So I think that generally the scientists have always, in a way, had more resources. I think that's fair to say. And certainly they've taken a kind of priority. I suspect that this particular collaboration also probably began with a push from the Brazilian side, with response from Kew. I don't know the history of this, so you'd have to tell me. But I think it can be the case that scientists also, the other aspect is that scientists think of themselves as having data which is essentially fungible. So it can be moved around, whereas the tendency for historians is to think of materials being very highly contextualized. And the tendency for librarians and archivists are pulled between two poles. On the one hand, some of them have the disposition of the banker. They believe they want to keep their library and their books and their archives safe from people who would otherwise damage them. And then there are other librarians and archivists who have the hermetic disposition of wanting to get it into circulation. But I think traditionally there have been librarians and archivists who've felt concerned about the control over the material. There's also the kind of issue of crown copyright, which is vested in these materials, so I understand. So it may be that in fact there are a variety of contextual reasons why this is the case. But I think it's interesting to notice that Britain is actually behind many other European countries in terms of its commitment to the digitization of its national archives. That if you look at, for example, at Spain, and the way in which the Archivo General de Indias has digitized vast amounts of colonial Spanish material and made it available, and the way in which in France the Centre des Archives d'Outre-mer in Aix has also done a similar kind of program of digitization of materials. There's nothing equivalent in Britain. So on the one hand, the British archives, particularly the National Archives, I think are the most wonderful archives in the world in which to work. They're extremely user-friendly, extremely efficient, very accessible. But they have much less commitment to putting material out there. I don't know whether that's a structural thing. I think it may have to do with the ways in which entities like the National Archives and like Kew and other institutions have been forced over the last 40 years to think of themselves as revenue-generating quasi-private entities. So that I'm, for example, to speak slightly out of turn here, I'm delighted to hear that Taylor and Francis is involved in creating a digitized record of the miscellaneous reports. At the same time as I'm dismayed that Taylor and Francis have this particular role, given their history in other contexts of essentially hiding large bits of what should be the digital commons behind paywalls. So that I do hope that that at least in terms of the miscellaneous reports, that efforts are made to make sure that researchers connecting from IP addresses in low and middle income countries, particularly those that are former British colonies, will have access to this material for free, so that the fact that the University of Gambia or the University of the West Indies or the University of Zambia cannot afford a Taylor and Francis license will not impede the access of their researchers and their citizens to these materials.
Great, thank you. So we're moving off digitization for a while. Sharon Willoughby asks, beyond digitization, what else is needed to make archives like these accessible?
Well, I think there need to be evangelists. They need to be people who essentially spread the news of a particular parts of this collection and its value for particular communities. How do you create evangelists? Some of them will come to you, to your library, and some of them you will actually solicit. And so that I think that I could see, for example, over the medium term, from the Kew side, a kind of deliberate attempt to kind of reach out to different parts of the world, to create vectors of curiosity and of engagement with particular resources which are held there. Because I think that's the moment it's all about, if you like, I mean, what's the Latour phrase? No such thing as a network, just network formation. So it's all the question of getting the network flowing, of creating the kind of cycles of attention which lead to material which is otherwise locked away in the prison of a database or of a bound volume. So it enters into kind of circulation, enters into conversation and debate. So digitization is only a means towards this creation of conversations, which indeed should be the ultimate purpose of the humanities.
Yeah, great, thank you. And I like the idea of cycles of attention, and I may quote it in future if I have your permission to do that.
Oh, you can.
Okay, Christina Hurrigan, you mentioned that, and this is one that sort of relates to subaltern histories and hidden histories, that those sorts of narratives. You mentioned that Miscellaneous Reports is a place where the opinions of, for example, under-gardeners might be found, rather than just the voices of the directors. Do you think they're particularly valuable examples of the real colonial botanical networks?
Yes, I think we're looking at, for example, okay, I'm doing this now again without my notes, and this is stuff I haven't read for a few years. But I can think, for example, of correspondence coming from a man called John Harrison, who is a colonial scientist, late 19th century, who ends up in Barbados as the government chemist. He runs the Botanic garden as it starts the experiments with plants. He surveys the geology, and he has a lot of trouble with the planters on the ground. And he, in the manner of Pope Hennessy, that's another story, but reaches over the heads of the plantocracy to make contact with subordinate groups. So if you look at his correspondence, for example, he is communicating back to London from his embattled position the views of people who he is in contact with. This is not really kind of in terms of the scientific, the botanical networks issue, but I think the principle applies, that these are actual letters which are being written from person A to person B. And the characteristic of these letters is they do not simply address the precise problem which the writer seeks to achieve movement on, but generally involve, as in the manner of all correspondence, a kind of more broad tour d'horizon of what is happening in the society and of what's going on, and including the voices of people who this person have been in contact with. So I'm sorry, I can't answer this question for you in a very kind of concrete and specific way, except that the potential is certainly there. At all the levels of knowledge construction that are taking place in the colony.
Thank you. I'd like to add, if I may, that something I've always liked about the Miscellaneous Reports is they, unlike the director's correspondence, they include internal memoranda, lots of annotated documents, and so it's a great way to see a dialogue taking place and levels of dissent within the organisation. And as you said, Richard, if you view them in the order in which they were bound and put together, then you really get a sense of the dialogue that went on before, the final version of the events was published in some colonial report or annual report.
I'd like to give credit here to a friend and important predecessor of mine, in fact, who is the former partner of Venita, who will be speaking tomorrow, Richard Grove. And I think that one of the things which Richard Grove did in his archival work, which included in part sort of quick passes at Kew, among other places, was to try to kind of show the extraordinary conflicts that existed within the colonial actors on the ground. So, there's a way in which you could say, well, the British were here. But within that category of the British in a colony, you have many different interests that are in contest with each other and which are forming alliances with one or another indigenous group for their own purposes. And that one can, in a way, kind of disaggregate and acquire a much more a complex sense of what the colonial phenomenon actually was, and some of its many contradictions. So that, Richard Grove's work, for example, on green imperialism, on the rise of forms of conservation in colonial spaces, comes out of looking at some of these battles that are being fought between people who were colonial scientific men on the spot and a variety of other British actors.
Great, thanks so much, Richard. I think that brings us to the end of our time on this particular element of the conference. So it only remains for me to thank you, Richard.
Yes, and thank you, Caroline, to you and Rachael for organising this extraordinary event.
It's an absolute pleasure. I'd also like to thank all of those who put questions. Apologies to you if we didn't get round to your question. But hopefully throughout the rest of the conference, you may find answers to some of those. So we're now going to take a 5-minute break before moving on to the next part of the programme. So we'll see you all in 5 minutes. Thank you.
Well, welcome back everyone to the next part of today's programme. I'm delighted to introduce Rachael Gardner, who is the project archivist for the Miscellaneous Reports project at the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew. Rachael has been in post for 2.5 years, during which time her work cataloguing the reports has given her an in-depth familiarity with the collection. And this means that along with her role as organiser of this week's conference, she's played a crucial role in bringing the reports to a wider audience. Her talk this afternoon is titled An Introduction to the Miscellaneous Reports, but first we will see a 5-minute video which will give you a flavour of what the collection is actually like.
The Miscellaneous Reports Collection is a large archive of over 770 volumes.
You've got things like pamphlets, maps,
Photographs, handwritten letters.
You'll find little sketches or plans.
Even plant and product specimens stuck down on the page.
It's a very rich source for looking at the history of empire and the history of Kew.
The Miscellaneous Reports Collection dates primarily from between the late 19th century and the early 20th century. And it really relates to Kew's role as an arm of government.
They tell this story that relates specifically to Kew's involvement in colonial botany. Sir Joseph Banks is taken on by George III as his botanical advisor. Banks really has this idea that there are all these useful plants all over the world. So you take the useful plant from wherever it is and you transplant it into colonial territories. Using that labour in colonial territories, it's a very profitable undertaking.
There are many voices in the collection, but what is really missing is the voice of the indigenous people. We see their knowledge of plants and plant uses, but they're not credited, and that story is frustratingly hard to discover because of the lack of detail that was recorded about them.
It's important, of course, that we recognise Kew's involvement and that we share that, be aware of past mistakes and put in place practices that ensures that that won't happen again.
Kew would also be asked to send people, so to recommend gardeners. And a story that has really fascinated me is the story of a gardener with the wonderful name of Edgar Spooner. We see the application form from Edgar Spooner asking to come to Kew. And a couple of years later, he's been sent out to be the superintendent of the Lahore Agricultural Society's gardens. And then you get to a letter which is addressed to the director of Kew at the time, Joseph Hooker. And it reads, "Mr. Edgar Spooner has left Lahore. He will tell you his story. I believe him, and I feel sure that he will not again do that which brought him to trouble. I do not recommend his going back to India, but suggest New Zealand. There he can live and die a happy man. Someday he must leave India, without passion, without interest. His pay is small, he may marry, in fact should marry, and then children come, the wife is ill, expenses, the hills and whatnot. India, the plains, is no place for a European in the position of Edgar Spooner." It was just the most mysterious letter I feel like anybody has ever written. It was a real example of what kind of personal story can be there in the collection.
I'm a conservator for the Miscellaneous Reports Collection. A conservator will evaluate it for damage and aim to repair and prevent any future damage that may occur. It can mean considering its long-term storage. My particular favourites have been some of the herbarium specimens. What I found was sometimes the person that was binding hadn't taken account of where the specimen was actually mounted or if it was mounted loose. So there was a couple of instances where I had to very, very carefully extract very brittle leaves from sewing, which was integral to the bindings. And that was a really interesting physical challenge in terms of dexterity.
The collection has a real emphasis on useful, usable plants and plant products, such as tobacco, opium, coffee, rubber, tea. One that I really love is Peru coca, so relating to cocaine. This was a product developed in the 1860s by Angelo Mariani, who's a chemist, but this advertisement dates from 1888. This was a Bordeaux Madeira-based drink. It was a mixture of Madeira or Bordeaux wine combined with the leaves of the Erythroxylum coca plant, and for each ounce of wine it contained over 7 milligrams of cocaine. It was described for its fortifying and strengthening properties peculiarly adapted for the use of children. It's just an example of the real unusual products and stories that you can find in the collection. The future of the collection will be that catalogue records for each volume will be freely searchable online. I think I love my job because each day I'm looking at the raw material of history. I never know what I'm going to come across.
It's such a diverse and interesting collection.
Be prepared to disappear down a few fascinating rabbit holes.
We have the chance to make sure that people in the future have a chance to benefit from the experience of the past.
Hi everyone. It's really fantastic to have the opportunity to talk to you all today. I hope you can see me and see the screens okay. Please somebody let me know if not. But thank you for joining us for this conference. The first thing I would want to say about the Miscellaneous Reports Collection is that although I must have said the word miscellaneous more than thousands of times in the last couple of years, the collection isn't really that miscellaneous. In fact, it's a distinct collection put together by Kew in the course of its own business over 150 years ago. It relates specifically to economic botany, or useful, usable plants and plant products around the world. It dates primarily from between 1850 to 1928, which is a time when the transportation and the cultivation and commercialization of useful plant products was of critical importance to Britain and to its colonies around the world. Plants such as coffee and tea and tobacco, but also linseed, eucalyptus, arrowroot, cassava, mangoes, soybeans. Plants were useful sources of food, medicine, clothing, construction materials. But of course, this translated also to sources of money. It was really vital to know what might successfully be grown where, and whether this could provide a useful source of income for a colony. So Kew would be asked for information about cultivating different plants. They would be sent specimens to identify or to analyse for their commercial value. They'd be asked to send plants and seeds to be cultivated in new environments. And they'd also be asked to recommend people for positions in the web of botanic gardens, agricultural and forestry stations that were being established around the world. But crucially, information wasn't just flowing out of Kew, but also back in, as Kew was actively trying to gather in information in the form of letters and reports, and also specimens for the museum, the herbarium, and the living collection of plants. In 1917, then director of Kew, David Prain, wrote the following: that Kew has been throughout its history devoted to systematic effort to acquire all the information possible of the native vegetable products of every part of the world. The result of all these interactions of this systematic effort is the Miscellaneous Reports Collection. And while I would say it might not be miscellaneous, there's no denying that its scope is incredibly vast, covering an enormous range of subjects, from sugarcane disease in Barbados, to forests in Sudan, to botanical exploration in Afghanistan. So what does the collection look like? Well, it's arranged in a historical geographical classification system, which was in place in Kew's herbarium by the end of the 19th century. Here you can see the series, the 18 series on the left, and an extract of how that breaks down into sub-series. Roughly half of the 772 volumes are fully printed, so that's kind of printed reports and pamphlets. And you can see some examples here. So you can see an annual report for the Botanical Garden of St. Lucia, 1895, and also the experimental poppy gardens, Diga and Meetapoor, Bankapur, Patna. The other half of the collection are volumes that are more scrapbook-like or guardbook-like, and they contain some of this printed material as well, but also a range of unique archive material. And you can see some examples here in TypeScript reports about rubber and cotton cultivation. The collection includes a lot of manuscript, handwritten, correspondence, receipts, invoices, and memorandums. There are photographs, drawings, maps, newspaper and press cuttings, and here you can even see at the top of the slide in the middle the results of a scientific experiment testing aloe samples of ammonia. As you saw in the film, the collection also includes plant and product specimens. So turning each page is always an exciting moment when you come across a specimen, whether that's wrapped up in a small envelope or displayed as you can see here. This particular example was quite alarming, not knowing if it was human hair. Here's a lovely close-up for everybody. Luckily it's not human hair, but fibre from the decayed leaf sheaths of the Trachycarpus fortunei, also known as the Chinese windmill palm, that was sent to Kew in 1882. So a key element to the collection, which makes it so distinctive, is the commercial and the economic focus, as well as the botanical. So as you can see here, the letterheads from this correspondence gives you an idea of the kind of companies that were in correspondence with Kew at the time. Another really crucial part of the collection is what it can tell us about indigenous plant knowledge by communities around the world. An example of this is here in a document sent to Kew by the governor of Natal, now the KwaZulu-Natal province of South Africa. It was sent to Kew in 1897, and it follows a letter where the governor describes a state of scarcity and locust attacks the previous year, which had caused a famine in the kingdom of Zululand. The governor attributed the absence, as far as he knew, of any deaths from starvation to the population of the Ubombo district's knowledge of food plants. And in this slide, you can see a list of these food plants with the Zulu name, its botanical identification, and remarks on how the plant was used. And here's a close-up. I wasn't sure how well you would be able to see it. This is an example of the kind of information, very specific, granular information about the use of plants by indigenous communities. But it's also an example of the problematic context of this information exchange, that is to say, the colonial administration and the unequal and exploitative power structures and control of natural resources. As you saw in the film with the story of Edgar Spooner, the collection contains a lot of information about gardeners sent to positions in botanic gardens and agricultural and forestry stations around the world. Like Edgar Spooner, these men would be between 20 to 25 years old, and they were frequently chosen from the gardeners here at Kew. In 1906, then director Sir William Thistleton Dyer remarked that 70 Kew men are in official employment in our various tropical colonies and possessions. The empire has to depend on Kew, which is organised for the purpose as an advanced horticultural school. And it's worth just saying again just how much information the collection contains about these men. We have their applications to work and train at Kew in the first place. We have their terms of employment. We have letters back to Kew about how they're progressing in their new roles. We might have an administrative dispute about their rate of pay. We might have articles from the colonial press about them. William Crowther, who you can see here, joined Kew in 1889 and became the curator of the Botanic station at Aburi in 1890 in the colony of the Gold Coast, Gardner, and he remained there until his death only 5 years later. It is also possible to discover the agency and voices of the indigenous and the colonised actors in these networks, but it does require in-depth research and often reading against the grain of the archive. An example of this is the story of Ferdinand G.R. Lee and T.B. Dowadu, which I came across when cataloguing a volume called Southern Nigeria, Lagos. A scheme was arranged between Lee's father, J.S. Lee, and the governor of the colony of Lagos, Alfred Maloney, to make arrangements for his son to train in scientific agriculture and horticulture with the view of him advancing agricultural and botanical progress in Lagos. Here you can see photographs from the Kew Guild archive, including photographs of Lee and Dowadu. This became a scheme for both J.S. Lee's son Ferdinand and also for another man, T.B. Dowdoo, to train both at Hope Gardens in Jamaica and also at Kew. The volume also includes a lot of administrative papers about the training and arrangements made. For example, we can see the telegram here informing Kew to expect Dowdoo and Lee's arrival. And here's an example of some of their travel expenses. But crucially, we also have letters from Dowdoo and Lee. Here is an example of their successful appeal to extend their studies at Kew, a letter written in July 1893. And this is just incredible. As an archivist, I always love seeing letters because they really give you a sense of the voices and the personalities of the people writing them. Following this story was a real roller coaster because you could see their hopes and also their disappointments when they were confronting the prejudice that you might expect. This was in particular the case when they returned to their positions in Lagos and they were underpaid and underpromoted compared to their counterparts in their administration. Much more work is needed to develop these stories further and to find out more about their lives. And my hope for the collection is that with the catalogue now available, further research will be able to uncover more of their history. So the Miscellaneous Reports Collection is an incredibly rich resource with significant potential for both historical and scientific research. It can give us contextual information about the specimens in Kew's Economic Botany Museum, the herbarium, and the living collections of plants, on how and when and why certain specimens came into the collection and who sent them. It can tell us information about knowledge of plants and plant uses by Indigenous communities around the world. And it can reveal agency of Indigenous and colonised actors in the global networks in which Kew was operating. The collection contains significant material relating to the histories of botanical gardens and agricultural and forestry stations and departments around the world. And it contains information about the global natural resources, agricultural development, and human impact on these. It is also a source for Kew's own history and re-examining its role in the 19th and 20th centuries. However, despite this huge potential, there have been two significant barriers to the collection being used more widely. The first is the fact that many of these volumes were falling apart. And the second is that the collection wasn't catalogued. So in terms of the conservation, you'll hear from my colleague Amy Crickmore in her session tomorrow. In terms of the cataloguing, this meant that if you wanted to access the Miscellaneous Reports Collection, you would only have a list of the titles of the 772 volumes. You can see a couple of examples here. Often these titles would be, so the titles come from the spines of the volumes, and as you can see here, you have Gold Coast cultural products. And often this might be an example like this, Egypt Miscellaneous, which really doesn't give very much to go on at all. However, as you can see here, this volume contains sections on cotton. There's a report on the disappearance of plants from the desert in 1892. There's sections on lettuce oil, mummy cloth, moghat and its medicinal use, tobacco and willows, among many other subjects. This meant that if you had a specific geographical focus, I'll just go back to that slide there. If you had a specific geographical focus, you would probably be able to find what you were looking for if you knew to look in the collection in the first place, of course, if you trawled through the volumes relating to that particular area. But if you were interested in a plant or a product or a person or an organization, it isn't possible to navigate the collection in this way. In 2018, Kew received funding from the Wellcome Trust to catalogue the Miscellaneous Reports Collection and undertake priority conservation work. Since that time, I have been working to catalogue the collection to file level, which means a descriptive entry per volume, and also to index subjects, names and places, and also plants. So this has used an integration with the online resource Plants of the World Online, which we hope will make the plant names index more reliable and keep track of changing plant names. This means that users can now navigate the collection in different ways and make connections across the enormous geographic scope of the collection. So at the moment, the first 5 series of the collection of the catalogue are now online in our online archive catalogue, and the remainder of the catalogue will join it later this month. So cataloguing such a collection has been incredibly interesting and varied. It's an incredibly complex and rich resource. But one of the biggest challenges has definitely been navigating the colonial context and implications of this collection. It is impossible to separate the miscellaneous reports from the context in which they were created, which was the colonial project and the control of natural resources and Indigenous knowledge. How we catalogue an archive of this sort has raised so many questions, from the use of historical place names. There's offensive and racist language in the pages of the collection. And it is also the record of Kew's own colonial role. I would love to say that we have managed to answer all these questions, but that just isn't the case. But these questions have been incredibly important in making us think more about how we catalogue this kind of material, and the relationship between decolonisation and archival cataloguing, and how we re-examine our procedures and protocols going forward. This will also help us to engage with the conversations that are happening in both the heritage and scientific communities about such colonial material. This is very much a first step. This catalogue makes the collection much more accessible and opens the collection up to further research and further projects. It also, by being transparent about Kew's history, and also by making the resource more available to allow us all to learn more about it, this supports the foundations of the decolonisation work begun at Kew, which you'll hear more about from my colleagues over the next couple of days. I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank everybody who has supported this project, including the Wellcome Trust, my colleagues at Kew, and the volunteers that I've worked with, particularly on their name indexing. I would like to thank you all for joining and being part of the conversation about this really exciting and varied collection, and I would encourage you all to engage with the collection and see how it might be able to help your projects and research. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rachel. In a moment, we will be able to have a question and answer session with Rachel. I can see that there are some questions come in for her already. And I'd like to thank Rachel for that overview, which is really going to help set the scene for the sessions to come over the next few days. But before we get to questions and answers for Rachel, I'm delighted to announce a partnership which has already been signalled quite strongly already in the conference so far. This is a partnership which we have just agreed with the publishers Taylor and Francis. Working with them, we will be digitising the entire 772 volumes of the Miscellaneous Reports Collection. That is over 166,000 pages. Taylor and Francis is building a programme of primary source digital resources which will serve students and scholars in higher education. And this will be available under their Routledge imprint. The partnership builds on the cataloguing already done through the Miscellaneous Reports project, and indeed would have been impossible to do without that work. It's absolutely essential to know what you have in the collection before you can really move forward in any way. As well as having the collection accessible through Taylor and Francis's resource, which will be titled Environment, Economy and Empire, Kew is able to make 10% of the collection freely available online at any one time, and that is equivalent to 77 volumes or 16,680 pages. Having the collection digitised will make it easier for us to facilitate access to it for researchers wherever they are based, and no restrictions will be placed on researchers who wish to reproduce scanned content in their scholarly articles and other outputs. Furthermore, the digitisation of the collection will open up possibilities for research in other disciplines, such as digital humanities, perhaps through the analysis of large data sets based on the collection. Kew lacks the staff, facilities or platform to carry out a programme of digitisation on this scale and to make it available. So the partnership with Taylor and Francis enables us to take a significant step towards meeting one of our key strategic objectives, which is to digitise our archive collections. And we are very pleased to be working with Taylor and Francis to digitise this important collection from Kew's archives. So now we have, I think, just over 5 minutes for questions for Rachael or for myself. I'd just like to remind everyone to please put your answers in the Q&A. And I'm just going to open them up now and see what we have. So going back to the start, let's see. Some of these are from the previous session. So Hugh Rowlands asks, in the Miscellaneous Reports Index, you mentioned subjects, plants and places. What scale of place is indexed? Is it hierarchical? For example, does it go into more detail than country level? Or is it irrelevant? Is scale irrelevant? Are place names recorded regardless?
Yeah, thank you for your question. And so place names at the moment are very high level, but the plan is to take that into a more kind of granular level as well. I think because the volumes are so they're catalogued one record per volume at file level. So the level of description is at that level at the moment, which tends to make sense to be, if not the country level, perhaps a region. But going forward, I think there's a lot of potential to place index much more on a more granular level.
Thank you. And another question about the content of the miscellaneous reports. You emphasise the concern with the economic uses of plants. Does this refer only to uses of plants in the colonies, or was there an intended knowledge transfer towards agriculture in Britain, for example, for the growing of pineapples?
Thank you. It absolutely also relates to Britain and to Ireland as well. Definitely, it was very much the network was all connected in terms of commerce, and also there is actually a Great Britain series, and that's available on the online catalogue now. So you'll see just how many volumes do you actually relate to the UK. Sorry, that wasn't the best answer, but yes, it does. Thank you.
That's fine, thank you. I guess related to that, I mean, I think you have just answered this question from Beverly Lear. Does the collection have material concerning the distribution of plants through UK gardens and to Ireland?
Yes, it does. You can see this is just, throughout the collection. An example I saw recently was about tussock grass from the Falkland Islands, and there was a whole scheme to try and get seeds of this tussock grass, and then this was distributed, not just England, Scotland, and Wales and Ireland, but also to other countries around the world. And you have lots of correspondence from other botanical institutions around the world about this as well. And also, I should just say then, in terms of being asked to recommend people to roles in these networks, this wasn't always kind of gardeners or recent students. This might be a more senior position, and there's a lot of correspondence back and forward between heads of botany and various institutions discussing who they might recommend, especially if Kew didn't have anyone in mind. So it is more than just the history of Kew and the colonies, absolutely.
And you'll be interested to know that John Bibby reports that Edgar Spooner did go to New Zealand, and he's provided a link in the Q&A, which I'm sure you'll be following up later.
Thank you. Yes, I should just say, I do remember seeing a letter about Edgar Spooner. The second part of that story is that I've only seen one letter, so perhaps you know more, and I'd love to find out more about what happened to him. But the letter I have seen is quite a tragic second chapter to that story. He writes to Kew asking for if they have any prospects of work in another position, because he is writing from New Zealand and his business partner that he's entered business in has disappeared with all his money, leaving him destitute, which is a really awful second chapter. But yeah, I would love to follow that up more. Thank you.
Question from me now on the digitisation of the miscellaneous reports. John Jackson asks if they will be open access. I'm afraid they won't be. The resource that Taylor and Francis will be creating will be on a subscription base, but we have had discussions with them about possible rates for countries in low and middle income. Countries who have lower middle income levels, to make access as broad as possible. But having said that, having them digitized will enable us to unlock access for researchers by coming to Kew. I understand that it won't be the same as having them fully open access. As I mentioned, we will be able to have 10% of the collection, which is more than 70 volumes, available online. So we will be exploring ways to make the collection as accessible as it possibly can be. But of course, none of it would be digitized if we were unable to enter partnerships like the one that we are entering with Taylor and Francis. Back to the miscellaneous reports, rather back to questions for you, Rachel. Are there many women reflected in the collection, for example, as collectors or correspondents?
Yes, thank you for that question. This is where my mind's going to go blank and I'm not going to be able to think of any specific examples. But please do get in touch to discuss further. But yes, they are. And again, you do have to look closer for these. But yes, I think often it would the wives of officers in these networks would also be very much involved in the collecting of plants, and they would be in correspondence with Kew. But not just that by any means. Especially as we get later in like early 20th century, we have female correspondence, and that is a really kind of interesting. I think it's, sorry, my brain's trying to work and speak at the same time, apologies. But we do have some really interesting correspondence. We have quite a lot of letters from Eleanor Ormerod, the entomologist, and that's very interesting. You can kind of see how she's kind of asking the director of Kew, I think it was William Thistleton Dyer she was talking to kind of promote what she is saying. And it's just very interesting to see that kind of the balance and the kind of gender politics at the time, but there are very much women represented in the collection as well.
Thank you. Another one for you. Are Kew archives making a connection with UNESCO's intangible cultural heritage, for example, in provision of data or evidence to support safeguarding efforts for Indigenous cultural heritage related to plants? Actually, having read that fully now, I'm not sure that is really a question for you. I don't know if you want to have a stab at answering it, but that might be one we have to take away and come back to.
Not as far as I know, but that sounds like an incredible project to be involved in.
And Ramita Ray has got a really interesting comment here. This is probably one more for me, but she thanks you for the wonderful video and presentation. She is co-editing a project for Taylor and Francis on the 19th century visual cultures of empire, and asking if there'll be opportunities for us to cross-reference with the project. I definitely think that's something that we should explore further, Ramita. So I'd love to follow up with you on that. Let's see. Question here, an interesting question from Felix. What do you know why the series ends when it does?
Do you mean in terms of time? In terms
yes.
of,
why does it end in 1928?
I think, thankfully, I probably can answer that question. It was the time when a new records management system was introduced at Kew, the registry system. So that's when we really see a change in how working papers were kept at Kew. So the director's correspondence collection also ends at this point.
Thank you. And very quickly, this is the last one we've got time for, I'm afraid, but I think this is an interesting question. Are the collectors, the actors in the miscellaneous reports, are they cross-referenced with any records in the herbarium collections? Do you know?
Not yet, but this is absolutely something that I would love to see happen in the future of the collection. And hopefully the catalogue lays the kind of groundwork to be able to look in more detail at making those kind of connections.
Absolutely. And there's much more, I think, to uncover in the way of connections between collections, both in Kew and elsewhere. I'm really sorry, folks. I know we haven't got to quite a lot of the questions that you put in the chat, in the Q&A rather, but we really have run out of time now. So it just is left to me to thank very much Rachael for the excellent video and presentation. We have now got what should have been a 5-minute break, but I'm afraid is actually now a 3-minute break. So please return at 4 o'clock UTC for the next session, which will be Stories from the Archives. Thank you.
Hello again, and welcome to the final session of day 1 of our conference, Stories from the Archive, where our speakers are going to provide illustrations of the kinds of stories to be found in the Miscellaneous Reports Archive, and they'll relate how this knowledge has shaped their thinking, their practice, and their writing. We begin with Ian Brown, who is Professor of Fine Art at Staffordshire University. Ian produces practice-based research both as an individual and as part of the artist group Common Culture. His research utilises video, photography, sound, performance and print to produce artworks exploring the human interface with both the invented world and the natural world. Today he speaks on translating narratives, the Miscellaneous Reports Collection as an artistic resource. Ian, the digital floor is yours.
Thanks, Caroline. I'm just going to try and share the screen properly. There we go. Okay. So hopefully that's sharing okay. If someone could just let me know, because
it looks good, Ian.
Okay, thank you. So presentation aims to discuss my initial engagement with the Miscellaneous Reports Collection. There's only been an initial engagement. Kind of pandemic got in the way a little bit. And the opportunities that the collection holds as an artistic resource. And I'll do this by drawing on the research that led to this stage and as a way of framing contemporary art research methods with other research areas and debates, namely speculative practice or speculative.
It's if you can hear us, you're really breaking up.
Looks like we've lost him completely.
Hello, I think okay, so I'll start from this part. So
you might be best to turn your video off, Ian.
My initial research Kew Centre investigation into plant-human relations, utilising artefacts within the library and archive. Oh, okay. So stop sharing. Is it not working? Is that better?
Yeah, that's sounding better, Ian. Thank you.
Is that better, David? Sorry, I seem to be having some, it keeps dropping out. It's been fine for the whole time, apart from when I'm about to speak. Can people hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you, Ian.
So, shall I leave the presentation off? Would that be better?
Yep, or just try the presentation without your video on, it might help.
Okay.
That's right.
Yeah. Oh. Is that coming through okay?
Yes.
Okay. Oh, it's coming up with some sort of error as well. Okay, I'll try and carry on. So initially the investigation into plant-human relations using artifacts and the Library and Archives collection, relationship through popular cultural forms. So the intention was to examine how the identified research methods can be exploited to provide new ways for audiences to engage in knowledge of plant-human relations and to be aware of the problems of certain forms of mediation in the depiction of this relationship. So working with botanical models produced by Edith Blackman, 25 wax models of orchids copied from Kew's living collection of Plant 5 and held within the Economic Botany collection. So the idea of a copy interested me and the status that they had as a consequence. They were simulations or facsimiles. In parallel to working with the artifacts, I'm with Dr. Gwyl Lewis, Legume Research Leader, with regards to understanding of taxonomy, its associated activities, processes and methodologies. What was also revealed through this engagement was both an insight into personal narratives, Gwyl's relationship to plants through his role, and discussions that arose around speculation as methodology. And at this stage, I was introduced by Gwyl to Hooker's Journal of Botany and Kew Gardens Miscellaneous from 1849 to 1857. And the relationship between miscellaneous and its potential relation to speculation was of interest here. So one of the wax orchid models in the collection was damaged and incomplete, with no base plate and no clear way of identifying the species of orchid it was modelled from. So it was valued as it was protected as part of the collection, but its status was ambiguous. It was this ambiguity that suggested a potential for examination through speculative research. So we think it becomes a property of dissemination, where meaning is generated through the speculative reading of the work by an audience. So at this stage, I began conversations with botanical illustrator Lucy T. Smith in terms of the complex relationships between observation, representation, and the use of narratives. We related this to the conventions within the important role supporting the publication of new species through detailed and accurate drawings. And one area of popular culture where plant-human relations were explored through speculative practice is that of speculative fiction, and in particular science fiction, but also the problems of some forms of this genre constructing plants as a form of spectacle, as entertainment. So I worked with Lucy to generate a set of drawings that moved from observation towards speculative resolution, from the broken artifact to a potential complete artifact, as you can see here. So this is an image of that doesn't what appears to be an observational drawing of something that doesn't exist. And I worked with Lucy to develop some of her drawings and into an animation. The research developed further in order to question existing prevalent narratives in popular culture in two areas: science fiction, where plants become other, and documentary forms. In the documentary, information is transformed into a commercial entertainment product, and therefore is changed through the process of commodification in consideration of the culture and generated by the audience. The synthetic was utilised, drawing on the model themselves through the use of synthesised sounds as potentially being emitted by the objects, plants, positing notions of sentience and communication through speculative forms. There's a short video clip. So then I was introduced to the Miscellaneous Reports Collection. So obviously the term miscellaneous suggests connotations of a grouping of disparate items, of a jumble or a confusion of information, or an archive where items that can't be located in specific collections are placed. And that's kind of Rachael raised. It is clear that the collection has a clear overarching subject area. But this is potentially a unique, rich and diverse set of materials. This is a consequence creates a particular dynamic of interrelated materials that otherwise may not be considered together. The collection allows for the complex relationships between the commodification of both the natural world and culture to be considered. So in one of the first visits looking at the collection, I was looking at the Gold Coast Cultural Products 1888 to 1906. So in this volume, there are 3 sequential sections: governmental reports on the potential medicinal use of the chua plant by Colonel Surgeon Dr. Robert Clark, correspondence from and about the German botanist, linguist and anti-colonialist Gottlob Kraus, and a letter from Governor Sir William Branford Griffith, forming a highly subjective and prose-driven account of a locust swarm attack on the plantations near Christiansborg Castle, Accra. So what I was kind of interested here is looking for kind of narratives that would likely be processed into commodified spectacle, and then challenging the approach to the transformation of that material. With the collection fundamentally related to economic botany in a colonial context, appropriation or acculturation is clearly important to recognise. In relation to this, it is also important to define the differences in appropriation as an interpretive method within the contemporary art context. So Rachael argues an interpretation is not authentic unless it culminates in some form of appropriation, if by that term we understand the process by which one makes one's own what was initially other or alien. And as Schneider argues, what is of interest here is the fact that they were conceptualized through ideas of cultural contact and the exchange of artifacts and belief systems between cultures and their constitutive elements, such as symbols. And he goes on to say, appropriation then is re-evaluated as a hermeneutic procedure, an act of dialogical understanding by which individual actors negotiate access to and traffic in symbolic elements which have no fixed meaning. So the Miscellaneous Reports Collection offers opportunities to continue this research with the focus on the potential translation or transformation through speculative research and appropriation. Unlike previous research on artifacts, the identified resources here are of course, not artifacts with implicit narratives, but artifacts with explicit particular stories, accounts, and narratives. So we've got some slides here, which is from Gottlob Kraus from 1888. And there are quite a lot of correspondence from Kraus to other parties. And there's a letter from Tysselton Dyer, having been in touch with Kraus about receiving botanical samples in the areas between Accra and Timbuktu. So there were some interesting conversations about him trying to raise funds, offering up samples to carry on with his work. But there's also a secondary set of materials that are related to his status, and particularly as an anti-colonialist, the information that they were receiving from German sources and German territory were defaming him and calling him a swindler and other terms. So you get these two accounts of a particular kind of narrative. And there's a news article about him wanting to become English because he feels wronged by the government. So there's some interesting information and then some confirmation from Downing Street that he would not be given British citizenship. But he lived, he learned many languages. There's a really good paper by Markoff and Siebold about him in the Journal of the Historical Society of Nigeria. And interestingly, there's some dates in that which these letters slightly contradict, because the paper says that he wasn't in Germany in 1888. And in fact, these letters evidence that he was. So there's something interesting there. And then the other set of letters that I was kind of interested in looking at are Griffith, the governor of the Gold Coast. So it's a really kind of prose-driven and emotional account of a locust swarm near Christiansburg Castle. It's called Ossu Castle now. And there is some interesting potential to think about appropriation in different ways. But there's also ways in which narratives and speculative associations can be kind of drawn out about colonial forces in terms of the kind of imagery and the notion of the swarm of insects, but also in terms of kind of ABMs, like agent-based models, which are used to simulate sort of interactions of agents and collective behavior. So I think there's some kind of really interesting potential in those. Obviously, this is all about the potential at this stage. So there are key questions for me around what speculative or appropriation strategies can bring to this material, and our understanding of its context from its historical and contemporary contexts, without kind of commodifying the narrative or undermining the process of transaction. So it's, for me, it's more about thinking of the potential of what these particular narrative that they hold can have for future research. I'm aware that I've gone on too long because of the issues, but I'll stop there.
Okay, thanks, Ian, and thanks for persevering when the technical odds seemed stacked against you there, but you won through in the end, and that was really interesting talk. Okay, our next speaker is Sarah Longair. She is Senior Lecturer in the History of Empire at the University of Lincoln, and her research examines the British Empire in East Africa and the Indian Ocean world in the 19th and 20th centuries through material and visual culture. Reflecting these interests, Sarah's title today is Objects, Islands, Empire, Tracing Collecting Histories in the Indian Ocean World. And before we listen to Sarah's recorded talk, I should add that she's not actually in attendance today, so won't be able to answer any of your questions in person. Anyway, let's move now over to Sarah's presentation.
Hello, and thank you to Rachael and the team at Kew for arranging this conference, and to those of you watching this talk. I'm delighted that the Miscellaneous Reports event has been able to take place online, and I look forward to hearing how others have used these fantastic resources. I discovered the Miscellaneous Reports Collection as part of a Leverhulme Trust supported project where I am exploring colonial collecting practices and knowledge production in Indian Ocean islands. I'll give a bit of background to the whole project first, and then focus on some of the illuminating histories I've been tracing through Kew's miscellaneous reports. I'm investigating how these islands in the Western Indian Ocean came to be understood and represented in the late 19th and early 20th centuries through collections and collectors. This research has developed from my earlier work where I focused on colonial Zanzibar, and now I'm looking comparatively at 4 different island groups shown here. So as you'll see, they're very small, so I've given a little bit of a zoom in here. And they all came into the orbit of British power in different ways in the 19th century. Mauritius became a formal colony after the Napoleonic Wars in the 1810s. And the Seychelles similarly became under British control then, and was ruled as a dependency of Mauritius until 1903, when it became a crown colony in its own right. The Maldives had an informal relationship with Sri Lanka, and Zanzibar, where there was an informal relationship before becoming a protectorate in 1890. Here are a few geographical details about them, and you'll see many interesting contrasts between them. For example, Zanzibar and Mauritius with sort of larger principal islands and several small ones surrounding them, whereas the Seychelles and the Maldives are much more numerous islands. And also the very different sizes. So looking at the contrast of Malé, the capital island of the Maldives at the bottom right there, 5.8 kilometers squared being the largest, and all the way through to Mauritius, several 1,860 kilometers squared. They also have geophysical differences, so the Seychelles and Mauritius having much more hilly landscapes in contrast to the low-level coral archipelago of the Maldives. Historically, the most important difference is that the Seychelles and Mauritius were not inhabited permanently before the arrival of Europeans, their populations growing first through the importation of enslaved Africans and then indentured labourers from South Asia. When I began researching these islands within museum collections, starting with the British Museum, where I then worked, it was the disparity of representation of these islands, particularly in relation to their political significance, which attracted my attention. All were subject to various ways of colonisation, yet their material representation is quite different and revealing. So politically, Zanzibar and Mauritius are the most significant of these islands, yet Mauritius has no single object made in them in the British Museum collection, and the Seychelles similarly very few. The Maldives, the least significant politically, having a vast number of objects collected from it. But thinking then, so the British Museum figures suggest that the Seychelles and Mauritius, with no indigenous populations, were not deemed cultures which were collectible in material culture terms. The chief scholarly interest in these islands, and with it significant influence upon what was collected, lay in their botanical specimens, directly as a result of their being uninhabited islands for so long, and therefore isolated from external influence resulting in unique species. Their very insularity ensured their botanical interest. As verdant islands, the potential for growing imported, economically useful plants was also a factor. So as can be seen from this table, due to the nature of Kew's economic botany collections, we do also have important and rare examples of 19th century material culture from these islands, which I will discuss at the end of this paper. So today I'm going to focus upon the Seychelles and its most famous botanical species, the coco de mer. This island group, as you can see, is located in the middle of the Western Indian Ocean and is made up of 115 islands, the largest you can see on this map. Like many of these so-called uninhabited islands, they were known by Indian Ocean mariners prior to European expansion. But settlement began upon them in the 18th century when the French claimed the islands as a territory and ruled them from Mauritius, importing enslaved Africans as labourers. Following the Napoleonic Wars, they were ceded to the British, who similarly ruled them from Mauritius until 1903, when the Seychelles became a crown colony in their own right. And the tensions and difficulties of this remote rule, it's over 1,000 miles as the crow flies, comes through very clearly in the archive. The indigenous species of the Seychelles, which has stimulated enduring fascination, is the coco de mer. This highly prized double-lobed coconut was for hundreds of years found on the shores of the Maldives, India, and as far as Southeast Asia. It was therefore named Lodoicea maldivica, the scientific name attaching it to the Maldives, where it was most commonly found. Rumphius, the 17th century German botanist in service of the VOC, believed it was a product of the sea, recording the reports of Malay sailors who described the tree as growing deep under the water. Malay princes in the early modern era didn't hesitate, in quote, to exchange junks laden with merchandise for single nuts, end of quote, and similar reports described early modern European sailors paying vast sums for them. In this period, the curious nuts might then enter European collections, for example, skillfully mounted with precious metals and becoming a highly valued item in a Kunstkammer, as in this example in the Waddesdon collection in the British Museum on the left. But these nuts also floated northwards through the Indian Ocean, washed up in southern Iran, and were collected and carved into kashkuls, or begging bowls, carried by Sufi wise men or dervishes. Designed for collecting alms, these bowls also symbolized the individual's passive receptivity to God, according to the website's description. They were intricately carved with floral patterns, blessings, the name of maker, and data production. Finally, in the mid-18th century, the coco de mer's origin on three islands in the Seychelles archipelago, so Praline Island, Koyré Island, and l'Île Ronde, which is very, very small, but is located at the far eastern end of Praline, was ascertained. So finally, the origins of these unique species was discovered. Many of the specimens and objects in the economic botany collection, which I mentioned earlier, were examples of the coco de mer or made from parts of the palm. And it was when studying these with Mark in the museum stores that he suggested I look at the miscellaneous reports. With the help of the archives team, I studied these reports in detail, as well as numerous others relevant for my wider project and the other islands in question. So these are just the Seychelles ones which I looked at, but there are many, many others which relate to the islands that I was exploring. Several illuminating themes emerged from looking at these reports. It became clear that the protection and propagation of these valuable coconuts was a major preoccupation of the British administration in the Seychelles in the 19th and early 20th century. Building on Richard Grove's analysis of the emergence of conservation practices in the empire, there was a clear tension between the desire to conserve and to exploit these unique plants, as well as policing their use by Seychellois inhabitants. Several copies of letters in MR 560 discussed the issue of the destruction of the palm. It was noted by Civil Commissioner Sir Swinburne Ward in 1864 that the coco de mer had, in quotes, entirely disappeared from many parts of the island of Praline, where it formerly abounded, destroyed by accidental conflagrations and ruthlessly cut down to make room for manioc cultivation. The land in these parts of Praline, with a very small exception, is entirely in the hands of private individuals, and no steps could have been taken by government with respect to preserving the trees, end of quote. We also read of specimens being forwarded to Kew for germination, and the failure in this area in London. Much ink was spilled over how to acquire a large part of what is described in an 1881 report as the Coco de Mer Valley, in order to ensure the palm's protection. The greater portion of this valley was owned by Mr. Campbell, in quotes, an old Scotch sailor married to a Creole of Praline to whom the property actually belongs, end of quote. The figure suggested to purchase it was not great, at £300 to £400, and it was believed by those on the Seychelles that the Mauritius government should pay for it. In spite of repeated requests and debates over the degree of the threat to the palm, eventually, following the deaths of Campbell and his wife, the lands were finally purchased in 1894. We also learn in the reports of the work of Charles Button, conservator of forests and a great source of local knowledge, who reportedly knew more about the Coco de Mer than anyone at Seychelles. Button was a regular correspondent with Sir William Thistleton Dyer and donated 25 items now in the Economic Botany collection, including Coco de Mer specimens, one an unusual 5-lobed example, and 3 walking sticks. These practical and ideological challenges were exacerbated by the nature of colonial rule over these isolated island territories. As noted earlier, the Seychelles were ruled from Mauritius throughout the 19th century, not just in the area of imperial administration, but also the scientific community. The Pamplemousse Botanical Garden in Mauritius was the centre of botanical knowledge in the region. Decisions about botanical issues in the Seychelles were made through Pamplemousse. Commissioners in the Seychelles were often frustrated by misunderstandings conveyed by administrators from Mauritius commissioned to report on the Coco de Mer. It was not until 1901 that a botanical station was founded at Mahé, the capital island of the Seychelles, a project triangulated between the Seychelles, Mauritius and Kew. It opened 2 years before Mauritius became a crown colony in its own right, and several documents in MR 561 discuss the creation of this botanical station, a new and crucially local centre for botanical expertise. The very miscellaneous nature of these reports means that while you do not necessarily find the answers you were looking for, you emerge with more questions and ideas than you started with. Such was the case with MR60, which includes a number of fascinating documents which record the writings of General Charles George Gordon and his interest in the Coco de Mer. I had already seen examples of his donations in the museum stores, and the reports put these objects in context. Gordon, most famous for his military career in China and his death at Khartoum in 1885, was posted to Mauritius in 1881-2 with the Royal Engineers. As we can see from this insert in MR 560, a key document here is the letter of the 9th of December 1882, putting forward his theory, in quotes, that the Seychelles were the site of the Garden of Eden and the Garden of Eden of the Book of Genesis, and that the Coco de Mer was the tree of knowledge of good and evil. The letter that accompanied this included detailed drawings of his specimens. He describes the sexual character of the palm and states that it has been argued that if this is the tree that was used to test our mother Eve, then this isle should be in the Garden of Eden. He drew on passages from Genesis to identify 4 rivers in the Bible, which he believes previously converged at Socotra in the northern Indian Ocean and then flowed south to the Seychelles. Towards the end of the letter, he writes, "It is the forbidden fruit, I feel sure." There was natural scepticism about Gordon's claims, naturally, and we can see Thistleton Dyer and Kew using Gordon's fame to support their wider cause. In writing to the Colonial Office in 1882, Thistleton Dyer sent on portions of the letter which advocated government action on preservation of the Coco de Mer, but omitted certain elements, in quotes. Portions of the letter, including a sketch map and section, have been omitted. Although interesting in themselves, it does not seem necessary to trouble you with further arguments in support of the responsibility which must accrue to the government in preserving from final destruction a tree interesting in so many aspects to the whole civilized world. Later in MR 560, there are cuttings about the Coco de Mer and its eventual successful establishment at Kew. In an article in the Daily Graphic is entitled Gordon's Forbidden Fruit. The links to this celebrated imperial hero and his memorable theories were useful in attracting attention to Kew's work. So we can see Kew deploying Gordon's theories for their own ends when celebrating their success in germinating this plant in London. As I noted at the start, my interest began in the object collections, seeking example of material culture from the Seychelles and Mauritius, so absent in other museum collections. You can see here some examples, in particular in the work of local inhabitants, known as Creoles at this time, descendants of enslaved Africans. The miscellaneous reports offer really useful insights into the production of such items. One of the first reports in MR60 describes the various uses to which the palm was put, revealing how almost every part of it could be used. The trunk as a water trough or palisade, the foliage as thatching roofs and walls, the down attached to young leaves was used as mattresses and pillows, the ribs of the leaves and fibres of the petioles for baskets and brooms, the foliage used for hats, and plats were made from dried unexpanded leaves. And one correspondent wrote, "Scarcely any other covering for the head is worn by the inhabitants of the Seychelles," end of quote. The shells of the nut could serve as water carriers, the lobes as plates, dishes, or drinking cups. This report and others in the miscellaneous reports represent vital evidence of how the local population created and used material culture. And as discussed at the start of this paper, as these communities were not indigenous, there are very few ethnographic studies of them, and this represents really important and unique evidence of some of these practices. In the context of the protection and preservation of the coco de mer, however, there is another side, which emerges in the miscellaneous reports, which is the curtailment of any use of the coco de mer which was not sanctioned by the government. Coburn Stewart, the Civil Commissioner, reported in 1881 that there might be a regulation to prevent the manufacture of articles made from straw obtained from the coco de mer. I really think that this would be a wise step, and I think that an export duty of 2 rupees on each coco de mer should be levied. This argument was also framed as part of imperial responsibility. In quotes, "The extirpation of any species of palm would be a matter of regret, but that of the Low Dossier would be a positive disgrace to the empire. It is absolutely unique among palms and is without doubt the most extraordinary member of the family." So we can see many of these tensions coming through within the reports and these conflicts. We have Button on the ground highlighting that the hearts of the young trees were being cut off for straw hat making, while the governor of Mauritius was content that no dangers of such extinction in reality exist. Elsewhere, specimens of fancy work of coco de mer straw were being exhibited in the International Exhibition at Philadelphia in 1888. So we can see numerous tensions here between the protection of the palms, the varying degrees of interest in the material productions from them, and the long-distance government of Mauritius hoping to play down any panic about their destruction and limit its expense and engagement with the issue. So in conclusion, the evidence in the miscellaneous reports is critical for my wider project in thinking about how these islands were understood and represented, and clearly reveals the limits of colonial knowledge. We see the practical limitations upon collecting as well as restrictions of the colonial government on material productions. Local knowledge is simultaneously deployed and ignored according to governmental expediencies. What I hope I've shown in this short paper is how many significant themes in colonial history can be interpreted from the miscellaneous reports, well beyond the world of botany, but also the political, cultural, and economic. And as I mentioned, the very element of miscellany brings so many of those serendipitous archive moments which we as historians treasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah. And I'd like to apologise before we go on to our next speaker, because in fact, I've since been told that Sarah is in the house and would very much welcome any questions that you have to pose to her. So do, by all means, put your questions in the Q&A. I should also add at this point that we'll be dealing with those at the end of the 3 speakers. That then brings me on to the 3rd speaker in this panel today, who is Marine Bellégo. Marine is assistant professor at the University of Paris, Her research interests revolve around the history of the environment, maritime and imperial history, and the history of the Indian subcontinent. Her book on the history of the Calcutta Botanical Garden, with a wonderful title, Enraciner l'Empire, will be published later this year by the Muséum National d'Histoire Naturelle in Paris. Her paper today tells of the connected histories of the Calcutta Garden and the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew. So, speaking on Imperial Gardeners between Kew Gardens and Calcutta, may I introduce to you Marine Bellégo. Marine.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Okay, and thank you very much, Sarah, for this fascinating talk. When I was working in the Calcutta Garden, people really wanted to show me the coco de mer tree and were a little scandalized that I didn't already know about it. So I am extremely honored to be invited to this conference and also very impressed with the very professional and efficient way in which the online event is organized. I'm very happy to have this occasion to discuss archival matters in depth with eminent specialists. The online presentation text about the conference states that the Miscellaneous Reports Collection is, I quote, a crucial source of evidence for critically examining and confronting Kew's own history and colonial role. And I think this is a most important issue. In France, many archives that are crucial for the study of the nation's colonial past in the 20th century have recently been made unavailable after a request coming from the army. The document I am showing now from the National Archives, classified very secret, used to be easily available to researchers who could even reproduce and publish them. It is no longer the case. Since 2019, such documents, which include those concerning the colonial war in Algeria, now have to be individually declassified by archivists, a process which can take weeks or even months. We find this worrying coming from a government that claims to be liberal, but has very recently accused academics working on colonial topics of encouraging Islamism. So, sorry. I have included here two recent works in French about access to colonial archives, just for reference. So the focus here on using archives as a tool for tackling the links between science and colonization therefore seems particularly welcome. There will be much more about this topic tomorrow and on Thursday with people much more expert than me in this matter. But this question was central to my PhD research on the history of the Calcutta Botanic Garden in the late 19th century. And I am going to take one example to illustrate this. One of the points I would like to make is that in order to elaborate an alternative history of the Calcutta Garden, it has been necessary to consult archives both here at Kew and in Calcutta itself. My story about imperial gardeners deals in many ways with questions of places and displacement. Here is a list of the files that I consulted at Kew Gardens. DC stands for Directors' Correspondence and MR, of course, for Miscellaneous Reports. It was particularly interesting to compare the contents of both types of sources, which Richard has already evoked earlier. The Director Correspondence contains letters sent to Kew directors and senior staff, including many letters from the Calcutta Garden, which was the largest and one of the most important of the British Empire. The content of these letters was not only scientific, it was also sometimes personal. At the beginning of my research in 2014, I first used the MR collection to access the annual reports of the Calcutta Botanic Gardens. Some letters from the director's correspondence show that those reports, as always with official reports, have to be taken with a pinch of salt. George King, who remained the superintendent, the director of the Calcutta Garden for 26 years, from 1871 to 1883, wrote to Joseph Dalton Hooker that he had to conceal some botanical activities that had no economic applications and therefore would not be approved of by the Department of Agriculture, which funded the garden. The other files that were of great interest to me dealt with gardeners, so that's MR 228 and 229. What I was trying to do then was to elaborate a social history of the Calcutta Garden that would not be limited to the story of its directors. A story which has structured almost everything written about this garden up to now. Indeed, the garden's administration produced historical discourses as well as botanical ones, and those discourses are usually very easily available. The Kew records contain, for example, an article by George King entitled A Sketch of the History of Indian Botany, which claims that botany in India was not science before European presence. Part of my project was to write a history from below that took into account questions of labor, hierarchies, and exploitation. The files entitled Gardeners show that the Calcutta Garden played the part of a botanical training center for young gardeners who, after staying some months or a couple of years in Calcutta, were then often sent to other imperial gardens in India and elsewhere. In the Calcutta Garden, they were called probationer gardeners. Some also occupied the function of assistant curator. The first thing to take into account when we deal with the workforce of the Calcutta Garden is that the immense majority of it was Indian. This picture, shot in the late 19th century, shows the staff of the garden posing in front of the great banyan tree. Some pictures such as this one, present Europeans in a position of supervision. The official documents of the government of India, kept both in London and in Calcutta, show that there were no more than 4 or 5 Europeans working in the garden at the same time. The total of their pays exceeded the total of the salaries of Indian workers, who were more than 200. Compared to Indian workers, young gardeners were privileged. In the strict hierarchy that prevailed among the white micro-community within the garden, however, their condition was difficult. The superintendent earned more than all his subordinates together and still complained about his pay. I studied the condition of young European gardeners through 3 complementary archival funds: Kew's Miscellaneous Reports, the director's correspondence, and a series of papers that I found in disarray in the Calcutta Garden itself. So they were in an abandoned building, and I transferred them to the herbarium building in the Calcutta Garden. So I'm going to tell you what I found in these papers, but it was very useful to first consult the MR files at Kew. For example, they contain rules about the recruitment of gardeners and the possibilities they had to be promoted, which were usually limited. In order to be recruited for this service, young men who wanted to work as colonial botanists had to be recommended by authorities at Kew, where they were already working. Some of them were not accepted on account of their health, which was not deemed good enough, and many had to have their teeth put in order, I quote, before they departed. There seemed to be a general misunderstanding about working conditions. The young men who enlisted hoped that geographical mobility would also mean social mobility, which was hardly the case. white young men could have themselves called esquire in India, but remained poor and subordinate with little hope of improving their condition. George King wrote in a letter to Joseph Dalton Hooker in 1876, referring to two skilled gardeners, "There is no probability that they will both remain very long after they have found out what a salary of 450 rupees in Calcutta means, and when they find that there is no prospect of getting more." What made things worse for the young expatriated gardeners was the fact that the Calcutta garden was not, in fact, in Calcutta, but in Sidhpur, on the other side of the river Hooghly. So on the left, it's just to situate Calcutta in Bengal, and on the right, you see the position of the garden as opposed to the city of Calcutta. Socializing was therefore most of the time limited to the very small administrative staff of the garden. In 1890, a new set of rules designed by George King specified that married gardeners would not be recruited and that hired gardeners could not marry during their first 3 years in India. Several gardeners were expelled on account of addiction to alcohol, and some others developed serious psychiatric troubles. The papers that I found in the garden itself contained the most detailed documents about this. One sad and telling example is the case of Joseph Halvey. It is dealt with rather succinctly in the Kew archives, but the papers I found in the Calcutta garden contain many more details. So this was the cover of the file that I found. This is just to show you that sometimes pages are difficult to read, but this is supposed to be a summary of the file. Halvey arrived in India in 1885, working first in the cinchona plantations, where he fell ill with remittent fever. This is actually a health sheet showing his temperature produced by his doctor, and which was included in the final file. He was then sent to the Calcutta garden as assistant curator and soon showed signs of mental troubles. In 1889, he had a violent crisis, which George King describes in this way. "It has been necessary to remove Mr. Halvey, assistant curator in this garden, to Howrah Hospital. He is suffering from hallucinations and diminished mental control. He imagines that certain individuals whom he describes as sailors armed with knives and wearing masks had tried to waylay him and do him hurt. As a result of this, he last night fired a rifle loaded with ball cartridge through the door of his bedroom. The doorman, who was on duty outside, narrowly escaping with his life. Taken in conjunction with a previous outbreak of the same character, the occurrence marks him as a lunatic of a very dangerous character, whom it is impossible to allow again to live in the garden." It was then very difficult for George King to find a boat that would accept to take such a dangerous person on board. So this case study is probably an occasion to think about places and displacement. The young probationer gardeners suffered from difficulties of acclimatization, a term that was usually used to refer to plants. In parallel, as a historian, it was not sufficient to remain in Kew to tell an alternative history of the Calcutta garden. I had to go there. What I found in the garden was a set of misplaced archives that I have also displaced and that were later, sadly, apparently destroyed by the garden staff, although I have copies of some of them. Maybe we can discuss this later, but thank you very much for listening to my talk.
And thank you, Marine. That was really fantastic. If I could ask you to stop sharing your screen, great. And if I could also ask Ian and Sarah then to join Marine, and we will have some questions. There's Ian and there's Sarah. Hi. Okay, great. Let's start with what we have in the Q&A. Well, the thing I think that we all want to say to Marine comes from Kennedy Cruikshank, which is congratulations on rescuing that extraordinary collection of abandoned documents. Can you tell us a little more? I think it's a story we're all interested in, and I know you blogged about this, but could you just say how you even discovered where they were? And
oh yeah, I'm not sure. Even I was convinced that I was rescuing them, but I think I contributed to their destruction in the end. But I have used them in my work. So I was actually staying in the Calcutta Garden. There is a guest house there. And I was encouraged to, use the library. And what I did was to explore buildings in the garden, because many of them are disused or sometimes falling into ruins. So since I was actually really staying there, it was rather easily to, just take a walk and see what was inside buildings. And in this particular building, I found those heaps of papers. And I was doubting that they contained anything interesting. And in fact, they contained files that were incredibly useful to write a micro-history of the Calcutta Garden. So it completely defined the work I did later on, because they enabled me to consider the garden as a microcosm where imperial problems were in a way concentrated and displayed in a way that gave a sort of window on what colonialism was. So that was the idea. Maybe I should stop here.
So someone has asked, were you given any explanation for why it was later destroyed?
Oh, okay. The problem is I haven't been back in the garden. I haven't, witnessed their absence myself. But a colleague of mine told me that the staff told her that the documents had been destroyed. So I'm not sure. I mean, they didn't know. I'm sure they didn't know what to do with them. And it really depends on who's in charge and who orders things. And without being there, it's really difficult to understand. I don't even know why they had been discarded in the first place. So I'm not sure about that.
Okay, great, thanks. So for Sarah, the Coco de Mer is always a controversial and fascinating subject. And there are a series of questions which I'm hoping that I can try and roll into one. Someone talks about the gendered understandings of the Coco de Mer, or the gendered reception, perhaps I should say, of the Coco de Mer. So perhaps you could say a little bit about that. And similarly, Lawrence Phillips talks about research that he was once involved in on the so-called aphrodisiacal properties of the plant, and whether anything on that had come up in your research. And I think finally, on the same subject, hopefully you can sort of take these all at the same time. I'm interested to know how far, this is Richard White, I'm interested to know how far Gordon's ideas of the Seychelles as Eden and Coco de Mer as the fruit of the tree of wisdom were shared. So how did these stories circulate, and were there similar ideas circulating at the time? So I'll leave it there, and Sarah, feel free to tackle any of those in any order.
Thank you, Caroline, and thank you very much for the questions. The sort of sexual nature of the object is something which is, well, it's quite fascinating the way it comes through in the archives, because it's alluded to, but in the miscellaneous reports, there's a lot of careful wording that slightly dodges the question on some of the nature of the form and the way in which it's described, which make for very, very interesting reading about how these ideas were expressed. Clearly, that has had a huge influence in the long-term fascination with these. With the object, but you see, I think this is something I didn't have scope to go into in the paper, but the wording, the language associated with it, along with this idea of tropical Edens and islandness and what exotic things happen on islands, I think is a really interesting thing, which absolutely I think is sort of playing into what Rachel White's question sort of talks about how these are the sort of the playing on these ideas of exoticism and how it's articulated, but also then we see the sort of stepping back from that in the kind of scientific way in which we describe things, and a sort of in a way not engaging explicitly in those conversations because they're scientists, so they look at these things differently. So I think there's a really interesting interplay, and something I want to dig into more is that language of kind of the allure of them, and what this says about, again, this is where it feeds into the bigger project about the different ways in which colonial islands are used, understood, and communicated. And I think I'm going to try and use the Coco de Mer as one object which tells us one version of that story, and then objects from other islands which show us different versions of that exotic story. But yes, and the Aphrodisia, I think, not that I recall right now, but there are some very dense papers on this in the miscellaneous reports. And I think there are several which go through the many different attributes of it. I was focusing on, in a way, its material uses, because I was trying to focus onto that kind of, how are these things actually being used, trying to get at the objects themselves. But the various ways in which it is described, I mean, and also some of those things are kind of, those are told sometimes as kind of not folklore exactly, but when the 19th century discussions happen, which is where my attention was, quite often they refer back to ideas in the early modern period, and sort of, and again, distancing themselves from that as a means of rendering their own science, very their research very current. In terms of Gordon's fascination, well, this is an interesting thing, because in terms of what we see is he writes these quite personal letters to Kew, explaining his theories and expounding them. But clearly they were much more widely known than that, because we see in the cuttings that are in the reports them, this being the selling point in the newspapers of, Kew has found Gordon's forbidden fruit, and has propagated Gordon's forbidden fruit. And so, it's evident that this is a much more widely known story, but I need to work out the kind of communications of how that sort of is exposed in other media. But it's a sort of very interesting slice of his life, going through between these kind of phases of his military career, when he's sort of sent to Mauritius, not necessarily the most sort of prestigious, and then we see only 3 years later he's back in he's in Khartoum, and so it's a kind of very odd little period, but he's very serious about it, and that really comes through in the archives. And I think that's again where that sort of body of work in the miscellaneous reports gives you this extraordinary insight into his thinking, and the intimacy which he has with the curators and the staff at Kew to be able to share these theories. And as I mentioned in the paper, how they are then selective about how they use his name and manipulate the message to suit their needs and what they need. So hopefully that sort of answers some of those questions. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks, Sarah. And talking about things that were cited and things that weren't, knowledge that was circulated, knowledge that was suppressed, Simon Schaffer has a question for Marine. He mentions that you astutely cited the significant message from George King that it would be dangerous and embarrassing to describe non-economic activity at the Calcutta Garden. Were there similar concerns about the repute of overseas inquiry as received by the Metropole among the protagonists of the materials studied either by Sarah or by Ian Brown in West Africa? So we're looking for, did either of you find evidence of concerns about the credibility, if you like, of knowledge coming from overseas back in the Metropole? That's a bit of a putting on the spot one.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of Krauss, the communications are very kind of very formal because they're coming through formal positions. But it's clear that it's in the book that I mentioned by Sebald that there's he moved through Africa really easily because he wasn't complicit in colonial activities, and so that wasn't something that governments, either kind of British or predominantly German, were very happy with. In fact, they were very angry with him, both for not being complicit and being able to move through territories really easily. So I think he was kind of he was prevented from publishing essentially any of his kind of research on different aspects, including linguistics, because it brought associations towards the people of the colonies that governments didn't want to be raised, essentially. So not so much in the collection, in the Miscellaneous collection, because it's very, I mean, you can read between the lines what they're doing. They're kind of closing in on him and saying, well, so-and-so says that he is not to be trusted, and therefore he isn't a significant kind of researcher or expert in the field. So, yeah.
Okay, anything spring to mind? Thanks, Ian. Anything spring to mind for you, Sarah? I mean, you have really given us one example already, I guess.
Yeah, I think what I find interesting, the previous example, but I also think that what I find interesting in this, in relation to my bigger project, is the way in which knowledge was filtered through the Seychelles, Mauritius, and then into Kew as well. And we see there's skepticism about the need for protecting these objects, these plants, which is expressed both at the level of the individual. So those are expressed in with economic imperatives. Mauritius don't want to pay to preserve all of these different areas and regions, and they aren't seeing on the ground what the potential destruction is. So there's very much a kind of local and inter-island, and then an imperial kind of context in which these discussions are happening. And in fact, we see more concern at Kew about the preservation of the Coco de Mer than we do in Mauritius, but the Mauritius has the control over the Seychelles at the time. So there's some very interesting use of and deployment of the knowledge about the plants. I think visiting commissioners going to from Mauritius to the Seychelles would say, well, we don't think this is such a serious problem after all, and not listening to the people who are regarded as the local experts. So the kind of the transmission of expertise and who is being trusted around this is, I think, a really interesting point. And so it was great to sort of have the feed into Marine's paper on that as well.
Excellent, thank you. Marine, I have a question for you from Ramita. And she's very keen to buy the book when it comes out. But in the meantime, she has some questions of detail, which we hope you may be able to shed some light on. First of all, did you come across accounts of how Indian gardeners were brought to the Calcutta Gardens? Which areas of India they came from? Were they then dispatched to work in other gardens from there, like the Viceroy's garden she mentions? So that little bit more detail about the body of gardeners.
Okay. Yes. Thank you very much, Ramita, for your excellent question. So yes, it's a very interesting question. So the Gardens administration complained about gardeners all the time. And part of the reason for this was that they didn't hire gardeners. They didn't hire Malis. I mean, there were Malis, but not many of them. They hired coolies most of the time. And then they complained that they didn't do the work properly. There was a recruitment problem, which is very important. I didn't manage to solve the problem completely, but I think the recruitment model was that of the plantation. So they needed much workforce, and they couldn't afford to hire Malis who are skilled. So they hired coolies. This is part of, the beginning of an answer, but I would like to find more about recruitment in Botanic Gardens. It was very common to hire prisoners, for example, not to hire, but to use the workforce of prisoners in Botanic Gardens, not only the Calcutta one, but other imperial gardens. So I found some elements on local workforce and local knowledge and how it was used, but probably not enough, unfortunately.
Okay, can I ask one further question, Marine, while you're still there? Interestingly, you were able to not triangulate, but whatever it is when you're using two sets of archives in a comparative manner, the Kew archive and the Calcutta archives. Can you say a little bit more about whether they were complementary or contradictory, or how they worked to inform you as two bodies of knowledge?
Okay, well, it was very important for me to work at Kew to understand what the official purpose of the garden was. But for example, there was nothing on Indian workers in Kew, or very, very little. So what I found about local workers, I found it in Calcutta, which makes sense in a way. But at the same time, I'm not sure I would have understood some papers in Calcutta without first, having acquired some general knowledge about gardens. So I think they were complementary.
Right, and it sounds like something of an iterative process in any case.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, okay, great. I think we are nearly out of time, but I have one last question for Ian, if I may. Can you just say, Ian, for those people in the audience perhaps who've not opened up their archives much to artists and artistic practitioners, what you think the creative gaze can bring to interpretation of archives?
Well, I think, in terms of kind of referencing things like speculative research or speculative practice-based research, and also things like, dealing with appropriation, the way in which material can be translated. Oh,
I think we're losing you again, unfortunately. No, I'm not sure we're going to get you back in time. Okay. Oh, there you are. We missed some of that, Ian. You sort of.
I think essentially it's about notions of translation and what those translations, what in terms of bridging a communication with an audience, but outside of more commercial or entertainment factors, and trying to draw audiences in to kind of material and narratives within it without a prescribed kind of bias or a prescribed position to take is often not one of illustration, but one of potential readings.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Very, very nicely put. Okay, we are almost out of time. I'd like to thank once again all the speakers on the panel for 3 fantastic, both complementary and contrasting papers. I learnt a lot, and I'm pretty sure that other people did too. I'd like to thank our audience today for all your questions and your participation. And this marks the end of day 1 of Botany, Trade and Empire. So on behalf of the conference team, I'll say goodbye for now. And we very much look forward to welcoming you all back again tomorrow. Goodbye.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye. Thank you very much.